The encounter that changed everything. Imagine standing on the edge of a dying lake in East Africa, 2.5 million years ago. The water has shrunk to half its size. Crocodiles patrol what remains. And on opposite shores, two groups of creatures watch each other across the mudflats. On one side, muscular, ape-like figures with massive jaws and small heads. They've been here for over 1 million years. This is their world. Their ancestors walked these shores when the lake was an ocean. They know every fruit tree, every safe sleeping spot, every predator's territory within 50 kilometers. On the other side, something new. Taller, thinner, with larger heads and smaller teeth. They move differently. They carry things. And they're watching the first group with an intelligence that borders on calculation. These two species don't know it yet, but they've just begun a war that will last longer than the entire existence of modern humans. A war fought not with weapons, not yet, but with adaptation, with innovation, with survival itself. One group will inherit the earth. The other will vanish so completely that we won't even know they existed until we dig up their bones millions of years later. But here's what makes this story fascinating. For almost 2 million years, it wasn't clear who would win. The outcome wasn't inevitable. And the species that eventually lost, they weren't inferior. They weren't failures. In many ways, they were better adapted to the world they lived in. They just weren't adapted to the world that was coming. This is the story of the longest war in human prehistory, the fight between Australopithecus and early Homo. And by the time it ended, it didn't just determine which species survived, it determined what kind of creature we would become. To understand this conflict, we need to go back to a time before it started. To a world where Australopithecus was not just surviving, they were thriving. Picture East Africa around 3.5 million years ago. This isn't the savanna you see in documentaries today. This is a patchwork landscape. Dense forests along rivers and lakes, open woodlands on higher ground, and yes, some grasslands, but nothing like the endless plains of modern Kenya or Tanzania. In this world, Australopithecus afarensis is king. We know them best through one individual, Lucy. Her skeleton, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, revolutionized our understanding of human evolution. But Lucy wasn't special. She was typical. One member of a species that had figured out something extraordinary: how to live between two worlds. Australopithecus afarensis stood about 1 meter tall, roughly the height of a modern 4-year-old child, but with the body of an adult. Their brains were small, around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. That's roughly 1/3 the size of ours, a chimpanzee's brain. But those brains were housed in bodies that could do something no ape had ever done before: walk upright, efficiently, for long distances. This seems simple to us. We do it every day without thinking. But 3.5 million years ago, this was revolutionary technology. Bipedalism meant Australopithecus could travel between food sources that were kilometers apart. It meant they could carry food, carry infants, carry tools. It meant their hands were free while they moved. And in a changing world, a world where forests were shrinking and resources were becoming more scattered, this was the ultimate adaptation. Australopithecus didn't need to choose between the trees and the ground. They could do both. They slept in trees at night, safe from leopards and hyenas. During the day, they walked between fruit trees, dug for tubers, collected whatever food the land offered. They were generalists in the truest sense. Not the best at any one thing, but good enough at everything. And for over 1,000,000 years, this strategy worked beautifully. How do we know all this? How can we reconstruct the lives of creatures who died millions of years before the first written word? The answer lies in bones, thousands of them. The sediments of East Africa have preserved Australopithecus remains with remarkable fidelity. Lake beds, river deposits, volcanic ash layers, each one a time capsule waiting to be opened. At Hadar, Ethiopia, scientists have recovered remains from over 300 Australopithecus individuals. At Laetoli, Tanzania, they found something even more extraordinary: footprints. Actual footprints preserved in volcanic ash, showing exactly how these creatures walked 3.6 million years ago. Those footprints tell us that Australopithecus walked like us. Heel strike first, then roll forward onto the ball of the foot, then push off with the toes. The same gait you use when you walk to your kitchen. The same biomechanics that let our ancestors cover vast distances with minimal energy expenditure. But the bones tell us something else, too. Something crucial for understanding the war that was coming. Australopithecus had powerful arms. Not quite as strong as a chimpanzee's, but far stronger than any human's. Their fingers were curved, perfect for gripping branches. Their shoulder joints were oriented slightly upward, ideal for climbing. In other words, they hadn't fully committed to life on the ground. They were hedging their bets, keeping one foot, literally, in the trees. This was smart. This was safe. This was the strategy that had kept them alive for over 1,000,000 years. But it was also a limitation, a constraint. Because every adaptation is a trade-off. Every choice about what to become is also a choice about what not to become. Australopithecus couldn't run as fast as a dedicated ground dweller, couldn't throw as accurately, couldn't make tools as complex, couldn't think as flexibly. They were perfectly adapted to their world. The problem was, their world was about to end. Around 2.8 million years ago, something changed in Earth's climate system. Something that would set the stage for the greatest conflict in human prehistory. The planet began to cool. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't catastrophic. It was a slow, grinding shift that played out over hundreds of thousands of years. But its effects were profound. In East Africa, the forests began to shrink. Not disappear entirely. Forests still exist there today. But shrink, contract, retreat to river valleys and lake shores and mountain slopes. In their place came grasslands, open savannas, environments where you could see for kilometers, but where there was nowhere to hide. For Australopithecus, this was a crisis. Their entire lifestyle depended on the patchwork. Forests for sleeping, woodlands for traveling, scattered resources for eating. Take away the forests, spread out the woodlands, and suddenly the math doesn't work anymore. How do you sleep safely when the nearest trees are 5 kilometers away? How do you find enough food when fruits are scarce and tubers are buried under hard-baked soil? How do you avoid predators when there's no cover? When every lion and every hyena can see you from the moment you step into the open? Different Australopithecus species responded differently. Some doubled down on their existing strategy. They became more specialized at extracting whatever food remained in their shrinking habitats. Their jaws grew larger. Their teeth grew more massive. Their skulls developed enormous crests to anchor powerful chewing muscles. These were the robust Australopithecines, Paranthropus boisei, Paranthropus robustus, walking nutcrackers with faces built to process the toughest foods in Africa. Seeds, nuts, roots, bark, anything that could be ground down and digested, they could eat. It was a bold strategy, a commitment, an all-in bet on a specific way of life. Other populations took a different path. Instead of becoming more specialized, they became more flexible. Instead of bigger jaws, they developed bigger brains. Instead of relying on their bodies to process food, they began to rely on something external: tools. And this second group? They were the ancestors of Homo. In 2015, archaeologists working at a site called Lamekwi 3 in Kenya announced a discovery that rewrote the textbooks. They had found stone tools dating to 3.3 million years ago. This was 700,000 years older than any tools previously known. 700,000 years before the emergence of our genus, Homo. 700,000 years before we thought our ancestors had the brains or the capability to make such things. Who made these tools? We don't know for certain. The most likely candidates are Kenyanthropus platyops, or a late population of Australopithecus afarensis. Either way, the implication is clear. Tool use didn't begin with Homo. It began earlier, with species we traditionally thought of as just apes. But here's what's important. Those early tools didn't catch on. The Lamekwi technology appears in the record, then largely disappears. For hundreds of thousands of years afterward, stone tools are rare or absent. It was an invention that didn't take, an experiment that didn't spread, until 2.6 million years ago. That's when tools appear again, and this time they explode across the landscape. Oldowan technology, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Simple but effective. Rocks smashed together to create sharp edges. Edges used to cut meat, scrape hides, crack bones for marrow. This technology spread. This technology persisted. This technology marked a fundamental shift in how some hominins interacted with their world. And the species most associated with this technology? The species that appears in the fossil record right alongside these tools. Homo habilis, the first member of our genus, the first human. Homo habilis wasn't impressive to look at. Standing maybe 130 centimeters tall, just a bit taller than Australopithecus, they weighed around 30 to 35 kilograms. Their brains were larger, yes, but only modestly so. Around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, bigger than Australopithecus, but still less than half the size of ours. Their bodies were still primitive by our standards. Their arms were still relatively long, their fingers still somewhat curved. They could probably still climb trees reasonably well. If you saw Homo habilis from a distance, you might not even recognize them as different from the Australopithecus groups they lived alongside. But they were different. Different in ways that mattered. Their teeth were smaller. Their jaws were less robust. They couldn't process tough foods the way Australopithecus could. They couldn't crack nuts with their molars or grind seeds with their premolars. On the surface, this looks like a disadvantage. How do you compete with a species that can eat foods you can't even chew? The answer is, you don't compete on their terms. You change the game entirely. Homo habilis couldn't chew tough foods, but they could cut them. They could pound them. They could process them with tools before they ever reached the mouth. And they could access foods that Australopithecus couldn't access at all, specifically meat. Not just meat, but a very particular kind of meat. The meat that was left over after predators had finished eating. The meat that was protected inside bones, inaccessible to any animal without hands that could grip tools. Marrow. Bone marrow is one of the most calorie-dense foods in nature. A single large bone from a zebra or wildebeest can contain over 2,000 calories of pure fat. Fat that's protected inside a hard shell that no lion, no hyena, no vulture can open. But a hominin with a rock can. This was the breakthrough. This was the innovation that changed everything. Not hunting, not yet, but scavenging. Accessing a food source that no other animal could access. Filling an ecological niche that had been empty since life first crawled onto land. Imagine the scene. A lion has killed a zebra. The pride feeds, gorging on the soft tissues. Eventually, they're full. They wander off to sleep in the shade. Hyenas move in, crunching through what's left, fighting over scraps. Then they're done too. They leave behind a pile of bones, stripped clean of every scrap of muscle and organ. Worthless to every other scavenger in Africa, but not to Homo habilis. They arrive, cautiously, carefully, always watching for predators, and they get to work. A rock strikes a femur. Then again, the bone cracks. Inside, fat. Rich, calorie-dense, brain-building fat. They move quickly, grab the marrow, retreat to safety, eat. It's not glamorous. It's not the image of man the hunter that dominated 20th century anthropology. But it worked. It provided the calories that larger brains demanded. And it opened up a way of life that Australopithecus couldn't follow. Because to live this way, you needed tools. You needed to carry those tools from place to place. You needed to find carcasses before other scavengers did, which meant ranging over huge areas. You needed to work together, to share information, to coordinate. You needed to be a different kind of animal entirely. By 2.5 million years ago, the stage was set. On one side, the Australopithecines, Paranthropus with their massive jaws, doubling down on plant foods. Surviving populations of more gracile Australopiths, clinging to shrinking forest patches. Together, they represented 2 million years of successful adaptation. 2 million years of living in Africa. 2 million years of being exactly what this continent required. On the other side, Homo habilis, newcomers, upstarts, a species that had existed for maybe a few 100,000 years at most, physically weaker than their competitors, unable to eat most of the foods that Australopithecus thrived on, dependent on technology that could be lost or broken or left behind. On paper, the Australopithecines should have won. They were established. They were diverse. They had already survived climate shifts that had driven countless other species to extinction. They knew this land in their bones, literally, in the structure of their teeth and the proportions of their limbs. Homo habilis was an experiment, a gamble, a strange offshoot that had traded the certainty of powerful jaws for the uncertainty of tools and meat. But experiments sometimes succeed. Gambles sometimes pay off. And the world was changing in ways that would favor the gamblers over the conservatives. The fight that lasted 2 million years was about to begin. And the first casualty? The forests that had sheltered Australopithecus since the beginning. They were about to disappear. The Crucible. The Pleistocene arrived like a hammer. Beginning around 2.6 million years ago, Earth entered a new phase, an age of ice. Not constant ice, not a frozen wasteland, but something far more challenging: instability. The climate began to swing, wildly, unpredictably. In cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years, the planet shifted between cold and warm, dry and wet, hospitable and hostile. In the northern hemisphere, glaciers advanced and retreated across entire continents. Ice sheets kilometers thick buried everything from Scandinavia to Chicago. Sea levels rose and fell by over 100 meters. Coastlines appeared and vanished. Land bridges connected continents, then drowned again beneath rising waters. Africa didn't freeze. It was too close to the equator for that. But it felt every pulse of those distant glaciers in a different way. When ice sheets grew in the north, they locked up water. Global rainfall dropped. Africa dried out. Lakes shrank to puddles. Rivers stopped flowing. Forests retreated to tiny refugia, pockets of green in an ocean of brown. When the ice retreated, the rains returned. Lakes swelled. Rivers carved new channels. Forests exploded outward, reclaiming territory they had lost millennia before. This happened again and again, dozens of times, hundreds of times, each cycle lasting anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 years. Each one a test, each one a filter that separated the survivors from the extinct. For the hominins of East Africa, this was the ultimate examination, and the two lineages, Australopithecus and early Homo, would take it very differently. Let's start with Paranthropus, because their story is both inspiring and tragic. By 2.5 million years ago, the robust Australopithecines had committed fully to their strategy. Their skulls had become extraordinary structures, engineering marvels built for one purpose: generating maximum bite force. The sagittal crest running along the top of a Paranthropus boisei skull could be 2 centimeters tall. This bony ridge anchored temporalis muscles so massive that they wrapped around the entire skull like a helmet of flesh. When a Paranthropus bit down, it generated forces that would shatter human teeth instantly. Their molars were the largest of any hominin that ever lived. Flat, thick, covered in enamel that could be several millimeters deep. These weren't teeth for eating fruit or meat. These were grinding platforms, industrial equipment for processing the toughest plant foods in Africa. And their faces had been restructured to accommodate all this machinery. Cheekbones flared outward to make room for the jaw muscles. The face was flat, almost dish-shaped, to provide maximum mechanical advantage. The skull was built around the mouth. When paleoanthropologists first discovered Paranthropus boisei in 1959, they nicknamed it Nutcracker Man. They assumed it ate hard foods, nuts, seeds, things that required crushing. It seemed obvious. Why else would evolution build such an extreme apparatus? But science has a way of overturning obvious assumptions. In 2011, researchers published a study that analyzed microscopic wear patterns on Paranthropus teeth. If these creatures had been cracking hard objects, their enamel would show pitting and fracturing. Instead, it showed something different: fine, parallel scratches, the signature of tough, fibrous foods. Paranthropus wasn't cracking nuts. It was eating grass. Or, more precisely, it was eating parts of grasses and sedges. The underground storage organs, the stems, the tough, fibrous bases, foods that no other primate could digest efficiently, foods that were available even during the worst droughts, when fruits had vanished and trees had died. This was brilliant adaptation. As Africa dried out, as forests shrank, as the foods that other hominins depended on became scarce, Paranthropus had a backup. They could eat the landscape itself. The endless grasslands that were replacing the forests, those weren't barriers to Paranthropus. Those were dinner. For over 1 million years, this strategy worked. Paranthropus boisei appears consistently in the fossil record of East Africa from 2.3 million years ago until around 1.2 million years ago. That's 1.1 million years of continuous existence. Longer than our own species has been alive. Longer than Homo erectus lasted in Africa. By any reasonable measure, Paranthropus was a success. So why aren't they here today? The problem with specialization is that it's a one-way door. Every generation, Paranthropus that were slightly better at processing tough foods had more surviving offspring. Their jaws got bigger. Their teeth got larger. Their skulls got more extreme. The evolutionary ratchet clicked forward, one notch at a time, for hundreds of thousands of years. But evolution doesn't plan ahead. It can't see that the climate will shift again in 50,000 years. It can't know that a new competitor is developing tools that will change everything. It only responds to current conditions, optimizing for the present while mortgaging the future. By the time Paranthropus reached their final form, they were locked in. Their entire anatomy was built around one way of making a living. Their brains had stayed small, around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, because brain tissue is expensive, and they didn't need extra cognitive capacity for their lifestyle. Their hands had remained primitive, because they didn't need to make complex tools. Their social structures had presumably stayed simple, because their food sources didn't require coordination to exploit. They were perfect machines for eating tough plants, and only tough plants. When conditions favored their niche, they thrived. When conditions shifted, they had no fallback, no alternative strategy, no way to pivot. They were the blockbuster video of human evolution, dominant in their era, perfectly adapted to their market, and completely unable to see the streaming revolution coming. Meanwhile, Homo was taking a different path. Homo habilis was never as robust as Paranthropus, never as physically impressive. Their jaws were weaker, their teeth smaller, their bodies more fragile. In a direct confrontation over a food source, Paranthropus would have won every time. But Homo habilis didn't compete directly. They competed by expanding the definition of food. Those stone tools, those simple Oldowan choppers and flakes, opened up resources that Paranthropus couldn't access. Meat from scavenged carcasses, marrow from cracked bones, tubers pounded into digestible mush, nuts smashed open without teeth. Each tool was an extension of the body, an artificial tooth that didn't wear down, an artificial claw that could be resharpened, an artificial jaw that could process foods the biological jaw couldn't handle. And here's the crucial difference. Tools could change faster than bodies. If Paranthropus wanted to exploit a new food source, they had to evolve new anatomy. That took hundreds of thousands of years, thousands of generations. Countless individuals had to be born, live, reproduce, and die before meaningful change accumulated. If Homo wanted to exploit a new food source, they had to invent a new tool. That could happen in a single generation, a single lifetime, a single afternoon of experimentation. This was a fundamentally different relationship with the environment. Paranthropus was shaped by their world. Homo was beginning to shape theirs. Around 1.9 million years ago, something remarkable appeared in East Africa. A new species of Homo, taller than anything that had come before, with longer legs built for covering distance, with a brain significantly larger than Homo habilis, around 900 cubic centimeters, approaching the lower range of modern humans. Homo erectus had arrived. If Homo habilis was a prototype, Homo erectus was the production model, the basic template that would define human evolution for the next 2 million years. Their bodies were almost fully modern from the neck down. Long legs, short arms, narrow hips, barrel chest. They couldn't climb trees effectively anymore. Their proportions had moved too far toward ground-dwelling efficiency. But they could walk. They could run. They could cover distances that would exhaust any other primate. Their skulls were still primitive by our standards. Low foreheads, heavy brow ridges, projecting faces. But inside those skulls were brains that could prepare for situations that hadn't happened yet. We see this in their tools. Around 1.76 million years ago, a new technology appears in the archaeological record, the Acheulean hand axe. This wasn't just a rock with a sharp edge. This was a shaped object, symmetrical, carefully worked on both sides, refined through dozens of precise strikes. Making an Acheulean hand axe required holding an image in mind, the shape of the finished tool, and working toward that image through multiple steps. It required planning, patience, and a kind of abstract thinking that Oldowan toolmakers had never demonstrated. Homo erectus didn't just use tools, they designed them. And then they did something that changed everything. They discovered fire. The evidence is contested. Some researchers argue for controlled fire use as early as 1.5 million years ago, at sites like Kubi Fora in Kenya and Swartkrans in South Africa. Others are skeptical, pointing out that natural fires were common, and distinguishing intentional burning from wildfire residue is difficult. But by 1 million years ago, the evidence becomes much clearer. Hearths, burned bones, patterns of ash that can only be explained by repeated, controlled burning in the same locations. Fire was the ultimate technology. It did everything. It extended the day. For millions of years, hominins had been prisoners of the sun, active during daylight, hiding at night when predators ruled. Fire created a bubble of safety in the darkness, a zone where humans could gather, talk, work on tools, share information. It transformed food. Cooking breaks down tough fibers, denatures proteins, kills parasites. Cooked food yields more calories than raw food from the same source. This meant more energy for brains, more energy for activity, more energy for reproduction. It provided warmth. This might seem trivial in tropical Africa, but nights can be cold even near the equator. And more importantly, fire opened up new territories. Highlands that were too cold for naked apes became accessible. Eventually, entire continents. It offered protection. No predator would approach a burning fire. For the first time in millions of years, hominins could sleep on the ground without fear. Fire was the great equalizer. Homo erectus might have been weaker than a leopard, slower than a lion, less numerous than hyenas. But they had fire. And fire changed the math of survival completely. By 1.5 million years ago, the competitive landscape of Africa had shifted dramatically. Homo erectus was spreading across the continent, from Ethiopia to South Africa, from Kenya to Morocco. Wherever there was game to scavenge and eventually hunt, wherever there was wood to burn and stone to knap, Homo erectus could survive. They were also leaving Africa entirely. By 1.8 million years ago, they had reached Georgia, the country, not the state. By 1.5 million years ago, they were in Indonesia. The species that couldn't compete directly with Paranthropus for plant foods had simply left, expanded into territories where there was no competition at all. But Paranthropus couldn't follow. Their specialization was their prison. They were adapted to African grasslands, to the specific sedges and grasses and underground storage organs of the East African Rift. They couldn't survive in the forests of Southeast Asia or the steppes of Central Asia. They couldn't process the unfamiliar plants of new environments. And even in Africa, their situation was deteriorating. Because Homo erectus wasn't just expanding geographically, they were expanding ecologically. With fire and better tools, they could process plant foods that had previously required specialized anatomy. They could cook tubers that would have been too toxic or too tough to eat raw. They could crack nuts, grind seeds, extract nutrients from sources that had once been the exclusive domain of Paranthropus. The niche was shrinking. The refuge was disappearing. The walls were closing in. Did Homo erectus and Paranthropus ever meet? The fossil record says yes. Multiple sites preserve remains of both species in the same layers. At Kubifora, at Olduvai Gorge, at Swartkrans, the bones of robust Australopithecines and early Homo are found together, separated sometimes by only meters. They walked the same landscapes. They drank from the same water sources. They sheltered from the same predators. But did they interact directly? Did they recognize each other as something different from the other animals? Did they compete, fight, avoid each other? Or simply coexist like lions and hyenas, sharing territory without sharing lives? We don't know for certain. The fossil record preserves bones, not behavior. But there are hints. At Swartkrans Cave in South Africa, researchers found bones of Paranthropus robustus with cut marks made by stone tools, marks identical to those found on animal bones that had clearly been butchered for food. The implication is disturbing, but inescapable. Someone was eating Paranthropus. Someone with tools. Someone who was almost certainly early Homo. Was this predation? Was this scavenging from natural deaths? Was this conflict? Violence between species competing for the same resources? We can't know. The bones don't tell us how Paranthropus died. Only that, after death, their flesh was cut from their bones by something with stone tools and intent. But consider this. We know that modern humans have, throughout history, viewed other human groups as less than human, as resources to be exploited rather than people to be respected. If we do this to members of our own species, What would we have done to creatures who looked similar, but were clearly, obviously different? Paranthropus might not have been hunted to extinction. Climate change and ecological competition might have been sufficient to drive them out. But the possibility exists, the unsettling, uncomfortable possibility, that our ancestors didn't just outcompete them, they might have eaten them. By 1.2 million years ago, Paranthropus boisei was gone from East Africa. By 1 million years ago, Paranthropus robustus had vanished from South Africa. The robust Australopithecines, a lineage that had existed for nearly 2 million years, that had survived climate shifts and predator pressures and everything else Africa could throw at them, were extinct. No descendants, no hybrid populations, no legacy except bones in the ground and lessons for those who would study them millions of years later. The fight that lasted 2 million years had claimed its first major casualty. But Homo hadn't won yet. Not really. Because the climate wasn't finished testing them, and the pressures that had destroyed Paranthropus would shape Homo in ways that were just beginning to become clear. The next phase of the conflict would be fought not between Homo and Australopithecus, but between different species of Homo itself. And the stakes would be even higher. The diaspora. 1.8 million years ago, a small group of Homo erectus stood at the edge of everything they knew. Behind them lay Africa, the only home hominins had ever known. The savannas where their ancestors had taken their first upright steps, the lakes where they had learned to scavenge, the caves where they had first controlled fire. 4 million years of evolutionary history compressed into the landscape at their backs. Ahead of them lay something else entirely. The land bridge connecting Africa to Asia, what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, was a narrow corridor of semi-arid terrain. Not welcoming, not obviously promising, just passable. A gap in the barriers that had contained their species since the beginning. They didn't know they were making history. They didn't know they were the first wave of a migration that would eventually cover the entire planet. They were probably just following game, moving toward water, doing what their parents had done and their grandparents before them, walking toward survival. But when they crossed that threshold, they changed everything. For the first time in 4 million years, hominins existed outside of Africa. We know this happened because of a place called Denisovans. In the Republic of Georgia, tucked into the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, there's a medieval village built on top of a much older site. In 1991, archaeologists digging beneath the village discovered something unexpected. Hominin bones. Ancient ones. Far more ancient than anyone thought possible in this location. The Denisovans fossils date to approximately 1.8 million years ago. They represent at least 5 individuals, males and females, young and old, and they're remarkably complete, giving us an unprecedented window into what early Homo looked like outside of Africa. What they looked like was surprising. The Denisovans hominins were small, smaller than African Homo erectus. Their brains were modest, around 600 to 775 cubic centimeters, barely larger than Homo habilis. Their tools were simple Oldowan choppers, not the sophisticated Acheulean hand axes that would appear later in Africa. In other words, the first hominins to leave Africa weren't the biggest, the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. They were early models, prototypes, creatures that, by African standards, were already becoming obsolete. And yet they made it. They crossed thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain. They survived in environments their species had never encountered. They established populations that would persist for hundreds of thousands of years. The lesson is profound. You don't need to be the best to succeed. You just need to be good enough. And you need to show up. From Georgia, the expansion continued. Eastward across Asia, following river valleys and coastal routes. Homo erectus reached China by 1.7 million years ago, Indonesia by 1.5 million years ago. They spread across an area larger than all of Africa, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from the steppes of Siberia to the tropical forests of Java. This wasn't a single migration. It was a slow, generational pulse that played out over hundreds of thousands of years. Groups would establish themselves in a region, grow, split. Daughter groups would move on, following game or fleeing competition, or simply exploring. Over time, the species spread like water finding its level, flowing into every available space. And as they spread, they changed. This is how evolution works. Separate a population into isolated groups. Subject each group to different pressures. Wait. Given enough time, the groups will diverge. They'll adapt to their local conditions. They'll develop unique features. Eventually, they'll become different species entirely. For Homo erectus, this process played out on a continental scale. In Africa, populations continued to evolve. Their brains grew larger. Their tools became more sophisticated. They were becoming something new, something that would eventually be called Homo heidelbergensis, the probable ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. In Asia, populations followed different trajectories. Chinese Homo erectus developed distinctive features, flatter faces, unique dental patterns. They persisted remarkably late, possibly surviving until 100,000 years ago, or even later. In Southeast Asia, something even stranger happened. The island of Flores in Indonesia is not large, about 14,000 square kilometers, smaller than Connecticut. It has no land connection to the Asian mainland and hasn't had one for millions of years. Getting there required crossing open water, at least 19 kilometers of ocean, probably more during periods of high sea level. And yet, somehow, hominins reached Flores. And what happened to them there defies everything we thought we knew about human evolution. In 2003, archaeologists excavating Liang Bua Cave made a discovery that stunned the world. They found bones of a hominin unlike anything previously known. An adult female who stood barely over a meter tall, whose brain measured only 380 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's, smaller than any Australopithecus, smaller than anything that had evolved since our lineage split from the great apes. They called her Homo floresiensis. The press called her the Hobbit. She wasn't ancient by hominin standards. She lived around 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. At that time, Homo sapiens had already evolved. Neanderthals were hunting mammoths in Ice Age Europe. The world was full of large-brained, sophisticated humans. And on this one small island, there was something else entirely. A tiny human with a tiny brain who made stone tools, hunted dwarf elephants, and somehow survived for hundreds of thousands of years. How did this happen? The answer is island dwarfism. the tendency for large animals to shrink when isolated on islands with limited resources. Elephants did it. Hippos did it. Deer did it. The same pressures that shrank those animals apparently worked on humans too. A population of Homo erectus, or possibly an even earlier hominin, reached Flores perhaps 1 million years ago. Cut off from the mainland, they adapted to their environment. Food was scarce. Being big was expensive. Smaller individuals needed fewer calories and reproduced more successfully. Generation after generation, they shrank. Their brains shrank too. Brains are metabolically expensive, and on an island with limited food, every calorie matters. The result was Homo floresiensis, a human species that had evolved backward, becoming smaller and less encephalized than its ancestors. A living demonstration that evolution has no direction, no goal, no ladder of progress. Only adaptation to current conditions. And they survived until almost yesterday, in geological terms. Until modern humans arrived and, probably, drove them extinct. Flores wasn't unique. It was just the most extreme example of a pattern that repeated across the world. Wherever Homo spread, isolation created diversity. Different environments produced different adaptations. Different selective pressures shaped different outcomes. In Europe, the cold of the ice ages produced a human species built for glacial conditions. Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals were cold-weather machines. Their bodies were stocky and barrel-chested, minimizing surface area to conserve heat. Their noses were enormous, with huge nasal passages to warm and humidify frigid air before it reached their lungs. Their limbs were short relative to their torsos, the same proportions you see in modern Arctic peoples, and for the same reason. Their brains were actually larger than ours, around 1,400 to 1,600 cubic centimeters, compared to our average of 1,350. This probably doesn't mean they were smarter. Larger bodies generally require larger brains just for basic functions. But it does mean they weren't the dumb brutes of popular imagination. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They buried their dead, at least sometimes, in at least some populations. They cared for sick and injured individuals, keeping them alive long past the point where they could contribute to the group. They may have had language, though this is still debated. For roughly 400,000 years, Neanderthals dominated Europe and Western Asia. They survived multiple ice ages, multiple climate catastrophes, multiple periods that would have destroyed less adaptable creatures. They were, by any objective measure, phenomenally successful. In the Denisova cave, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, researchers found a finger bone. Just a finger bone. A fragment from a juvenile female who lived approximately 40,000 years ago. Unremarkable to look at. One of millions of bone fragments scattered across the archaeological sites of Eurasia. But in 2010, scientists extracted DNA from that bone. And what they found rewrote our understanding of human history. The girl from Denisova Cave wasn't Neanderthal. She wasn't Homo sapiens. She wasn't any species previously known to science. She was something else. Something that had diverged from our lineage perhaps 400,000 years ago. Something that had evolved separately for hundreds of millennia, developing its own unique genetic signature. They called her species Denisovans, after the cave where she was found. we know almost nothing about what Denisovans looked like. We have only a handful of bones, that finger, a few teeth, a piece of skull. Not enough to reconstruct their appearance, their behavior, or their way of life. But we know they existed. We know they spread across Asia. Genetic traces of Denisovan ancestry appear in modern populations from Tibet to Australia. We know they interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. We know they adapted to high altitudes. Modern Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene that helps them survive at elevations that would incapacitate most humans. And we know they're gone now. Like Neanderthals, like Homo floresiensis, like every other human species that once existed. This is the pattern that emerges from the last 2 million years. Proliferation followed by extinction. At the peak of human diversity, perhaps around 100,000 years ago, at least 5 human species walked the Earth simultaneously. Probably more if we count populations we haven't discovered yet. Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, Homo erectus persisting in Southeast Asia, Homo floresiensis on their island refuge. Perhaps others in Africa, Homo naledi, Homo heidelbergensis remnants, populations we don't have names for yet. The planet was full of humans, different kinds of humans. Humans adapted to different environments, following different strategies, living different lives. This was normal. This was the default state. For 2 million years, having multiple human species was simply how the world worked. The idea that there should be only one kind of human, that one species should dominate the entire planet, would have seemed absurd. And then something changed. Around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to expand out of Africa. Within 50,000 years, every other human species would be extinct. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't climate change. This wasn't bad luck. Something about Homo sapiens was different. Something that made coexistence impossible. Something that turned the ancient pattern of human diversity into a world with only one survivor. What made us different? This is perhaps the most important question in human prehistory, and the answer is still being debated. Some researchers point to technology. Homo sapiens developed more sophisticated tools than any previous species. Our blades were thinner, our points were sharper, our weapons were more deadly. We invented the atlatl, the spear thrower, which allowed us to kill from distances our competitors couldn't match. Some point to language. While other human species may have had some form of communication, Homo sapiens appears to have developed true symbolic language. The ability to discuss abstractions, to plan for distant futures, to share complex ideas across generations. Some point to social organization. Homo sapiens formed larger, more complex social networks than Neanderthals. We could coordinate groups of hundreds where they coordinated groups of dozens. In conflicts, numbers matter. Some point to something harder to define: behavioral flexibility. The ability to innovate rapidly, to abandon strategies that weren't working, to adopt new technologies, new foods, new territories with a speed that other species couldn't match. Probably all of these factors mattered. Probably none of them alone was decisive. The advantage of Homo sapiens was likely cumulative, a package of traits that reinforced each other, creating a feedback loop of increasing capability. But whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Everywhere Homo sapiens went, other humans disappeared. The timing is damning. Neanderthals had survived in Europe for 400,000 years. They had endured ice ages that would have killed most species. They had developed their own sophisticated tools, their own cultural traditions, their own ways of making a living. Then Homo sapiens arrived, approximately 45,000 years ago. Within 5,000 years, Neanderthals were gone. The same pattern repeated everywhere. In Southeast Asia, late surviving Homo erectus populations vanished within a few thousand years of modern human arrival. On Flores, Homo floresiensis disappeared around the same time Homo sapiens reached the island. Denisovans, Homo naledi, every human species that overlapped with Homo sapiens, gone. Did we kill them? It's the obvious question, the uncomfortable question, the question that turns human prehistory from a story of triumph into something darker. The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. But the circumstantial evidence is troubling. We know that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals competed for the same resources, the same game animals, the same shelter sites, the same territories. When two species occupy the same ecological niche, competition is inevitable. And in competition, superior technology and larger group sizes are decisive advantages. We know that violence was common among early Homo sapiens. Archaeological sites are full of evidence: defensive fortifications, mass graves, skulls with projectile injuries. Our ancestors were not peaceful. They fought each other constantly. Why would they have treated other human species any differently? We know that throughout recorded history, when human groups with technological advantages have encountered groups without them, the results have been catastrophic for the less advanced groups. Not always through direct violence. Disease, displacement, and resource competition can be equally deadly. But the pattern is consistent. And we know that Neanderthal populations were already stressed when Homo sapiens arrived. Climate fluctuations had reduced their numbers. Their genetic diversity was low, suggesting populations near extinction levels. They were vulnerable. Did we push them over the edge? Did we hunt them, fight them, take their territories, and leave them nowhere to survive? Or did we simply outcompete them? Take the best hunting grounds, monopolize the key resources, leave them the scraps until the scraps weren't enough? Maybe both. Maybe it varied by region. Maybe some Neanderthal groups were killed, others starved, others simply absorbed through interbreeding. Because that's the final piece of the puzzle. We didn't just replace them, we merged with them. In 2010, the same year that Denisovans were discovered, researchers announced another stunning finding. Non-African modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every person of European or Asian descent comes from Neanderthal ancestors. This means interbreeding. This means that, at some point, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals didn't just coexist. They had children together. Children who survived, reproduced, and passed their mixed heritage down through the generations to the present day. The war that lasted 2 million years didn't end with complete annihilation. It ended with absorption, with assimilation, with the genetic legacy of our competitors preserved inside our own DNA. Denisovans, too. Modern Melanesians carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans carry Denisovan genes that help them survive at high altitude. The species that vanished still exist in fragments, scattered across the genome of every human alive. This changes the story. It complicates the narrative of simple conquest. Our ancestors didn't just destroy the other human species. They joined with them. The boundary between us and them was more permeable than we imagined. The war was also somehow a marriage. But in the end, it didn't matter. The other species still disappeared. Whether through violence or competition or assimilation, the diversity of the human family tree was pruned down to a single surviving branch. Us. Only us. By 30,000 years ago, it was over. The last Neanderthals died in their final refuges: Gibraltar, possibly the Crimean Peninsula, a few other isolated pockets where they had held on past their time. The last Denisovans faded somewhere in Asia, their end unmarked and unrecorded. Homo floresiensis vanished on their island when modern humans arrived. The fight that lasted 2 million years, from the first emergence of Homo in Africa to the final extinction of our competitors, had reached its conclusion. One species remained. One species inherited the Earth. We like to think we won through superiority, through intelligence, creativity, adaptability, through being better. But better is a dangerous word in evolution. Paranthropus was better at eating tough plant foods. Neanderthals were better at surviving cold climates. Homo floresiensis was better at thriving on limited island resources. We weren't better, we were different. Different in ways that happened to match the challenges of the particular moment in Earth's history when we expanded. Different in ways that allowed us to outcompete, outlast, and ultimately absorb or eliminate every other human species. If the climate had shifted differently, if we had arrived in Europe during a warming period rather than a cooling one, if the pressures had favored Neanderthal adaptations rather than ours, the outcome might have been different. The survivor might have been different. This is the lesson of 2 million years of human evolution. There is no destiny. There is no inevitable trajectory toward us. There is only adaptation, competition, and contingency. The species that wins is simply the species that survives. And survival, it turns out, is not about being the best. It's about being the last. The cost of victory. Stand in any city on Earth. Look around you. 7 billion people. One species. Homo sapiens, spread across every continent, adapted to every climate, speaking thousands of languages, building civilizations that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. We have walked on the moon. We have split the atom. We have decoded the very molecules that make us what we are. By any measure, we won. But victory always has a price, and the price of our triumph over every other human species may be higher than we realize. Because we didn't just defeat our competitors. We erased them so completely that until 2 centuries ago, we didn't even know they had existed. We forgot that human had ever meant anything other than us. We assumed, with the confidence of the sole survivor, that our dominance was natural, inevitable, ordained. It wasn't. it isn't. And understanding the fight that lasted 2 million years forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what we are, how we got here, and where we might be going. Let's start with what we lost. Not just species, though that alone is significant. We lost alternatives, possibilities, different ways of being human that might have led to outcomes we can barely imagine. Consider the Neanderthals. For 400,000 years, they developed their own solutions to the problems of existence, their own technologies, their own social structures, their own relationships with the natural world. They weren't failed humans practicing for the arrival of the real thing. They were a separate experiment, a parallel attempt at intelligence, culture, and meaning. What might Neanderthal civilization have looked like if they had survived? We can only speculate, but we know some things about how they differed from us. Their brains were organized differently, larger visual cortices, different proportions of various regions. They may have processed the world in ways we can't fully comprehend, seen patterns we miss, understood relationships that escape us. Their social groups were smaller than ours. They appear to have operated in tight-knit bands rather than the sprawling networks that characterize Homo sapiens. This might seem like a disadvantage. It was in competition with us, but it might also have meant something else. Deeper bonds, more intimate relationships, a different balance between individual and group. Their technology changed slowly. For hundreds of thousands of years, they made essentially the same tools. Again, this seems like a limitation, but it might also reflect a different relationship with tradition, a different approach to knowledge, where wisdom was preserved rather than constantly overturned. We'll never know what they might have become, what art they might have created, what philosophies they might have developed, what balance they might have struck with the natural world. Because we didn't give them the chance. The same is true for every human species we eliminated. Denisovans, a population so mysterious we don't even know what they looked like, yet they survived across vast stretches of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. What adaptations had they developed? What knowledge had they accumulated? What perspectives on existence had emerged from their unique evolutionary journey? Gone. Absorbed into our genome as scattered fragments, but lost as a living tradition. Homo floresiensis, proof that human intelligence could take radically different forms. That brains 1/3 the size of ours could still make tools, hunt elephants, survive for millennia. What might they have taught us about the relationship between brain size and capability? About alternative paths to cognition? Gone. Extinguished within a few thousand years of our arrival. Homo erectus, our own ancestors in some sense, but also a separate lineage that persisted alongside us for over 1 million years. The most successful human species in terms of duration and geographic spread. What had they learned in their nearly 2 million years of existence? What wisdom had accumulated in their traditions? Gone, replaced by their own descendants, carrying none of their knowledge forward. This matters because diversity is not just a feel-good concept. In biological terms, diversity is survival. When a species exists in multiple forms, occupying multiple niches, it's protected against catastrophe. A disease that kills one variant might spare another. A climate shift that devastates one population might favor a different one. Diversity is insurance against the unknown. For 2 million years, the human lineage had this insurance. Multiple species, multiple strategies, multiple ways of being human. If one approach failed, others might succeed. The human experiment was spread across many baskets. Then we consolidated it into one. Today, there is no backup, no alternative. If something goes wrong for Homo sapiens, a pandemic, a nuclear war, a climate catastrophe, something we haven't even imagined, there's no other human species waiting in the wings to carry the torch forward. We are it, the sole surviving branch of a once diverse tree. This is usually presented as triumph, the pinnacle of evolution, the winner-take-all outcome of millions of years of competition. But it's also fragility, a single point of failure, an all-or-nothing bet on one particular way of being human. Here's the darkest part of the story. The patterns we used to eliminate other human species, the competitive exclusion, the resource monopolization, the possible violence, we didn't stop using those patterns once we were alone. We turned them on ourselves. Look at human history. Really look at it. Not the sanitized version we teach in schools, but the actual record of what we've done to each other. Conquest, colonization, genocide, slavery. Again and again, human groups have encountered other human groups and applied the same logic that worked against Neanderthals. Take their resources, occupy their territories, eliminate the competition. The Tasmanian Aboriginals, isolated on their island for 10,000 years, developing unique adaptations and culture, encountered European colonizers in the 1800s. Within 75 years, they were functionally extinct. Not through natural competition, but through deliberate violence, forced relocation, and introduced disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, descended from populations that had crossed from Asia during the Ice Age, developing civilizations from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, lost 90% of their population within a century of European contact. Some through warfare, most through diseases their immune systems had never encountered. The list goes on. The Congo under Leopold, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda. The pattern repeats with nauseating regularity. We didn't stop being the species that eliminated its competitors. We just ran out of other species to eliminate. So we created categories within our own species, defined some groups as other, applied the same brutal logic that had served us so well for 2 million years. This is not to say that humans are uniquely evil. We're not. The same species that committed genocide also created art, music, literature. The same species that enslaved millions also developed human rights, democracy, international law. We contain multitudes. We are capable of extraordinary compassion alongside extraordinary cruelty. But we cannot understand ourselves, truly understand what we are and why we act the way we do, without acknowledging the full picture. Without recognizing that the behaviors we call inhuman are in fact deeply human, rooted in evolutionary patterns that predate our species, honed over millions of years of competition with other human lineages. The capacity for violence against perceived outsiders isn't a bug in human psychology. It's a feature, one that served our ancestors well as they outcompeted Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus, one that we inherited along with their genes. The challenge of civilization is not to eliminate this capacity. We can't. It's wired too deeply. But to redirect it, to expand the definition of us until there is no them, to recognize that the boundaries we draw between human groups are arbitrary, recent, and ultimately self-destructive. We are one species now. There is no other human to compete with. The only existential threats we face come from ourselves. Let's return to the question that started this journey. Who really won the fight that lasted 2 million years? The obvious answer is, we did. Homo sapiens, the last ones standing. The species that inherited the earth while all others fell away. But this answer feels incomplete, unsatisfying. Like saying the winner of a lottery is better than everyone who bought losing tickets. We won, yes, but winning wasn't the result of some innate superiority. It was the result of circumstance, contingency, and chance. The right adaptations at the right time in the right place. A few degrees of temperature difference, a few thousand years of timing, a few random mutations, and the outcome might have been completely different. Neanderthals survived for 400,000 years. We've existed for 300,000. They persisted through climate extremes that would have destroyed us. If we're measuring success by duration, they're winning until we survive another 100,000 years. Paranthropus boisei lasted for 1.1 million years with their specialized strategy. We've been behaviorally modern for maybe 70,000 years. They outperformed us by a factor of 15 in terms of how long their approach worked. Even Homo erectus, the species we descended from, existed for nearly 2 million years. They spread across 3 continents long before we did. They invented fire before we existed. By some measures, they're the most successful human species that ever lived. We're not the winners yet. We're the survivors, the last ones left. But survival is not victory. It's just the absence of defeat, so far. And the future is not guaranteed. This is perhaps the most important lesson of 2 million years of human evolution. Species that seem invincible, inevitable, permanent, they end. Always. Without exception. The dinosaurs dominated for 165 million years. Then they were gone, replaced by creatures that had been marginal, insignificant, cowering in the shadows. Paranthropus seemed perfectly adapted to their environment until the environment changed, and their adaptations became traps. Neanderthals had survived ice ages, megadroughts, and volcanic winters. But they couldn't survive us. What makes us think we are different? We have technology, yes. We have science, medicine, agriculture. We have transformed the planet to serve our needs. We seem invincible. But so did every species before it went extinct. The threats we face today are, in many ways, of our own making. Climate change, driven by the same technologies that made us dominant. Nuclear weapons, the ultimate expression of our capacity for destruction. Pandemics, amplified by the global networks that connect our billions. Artificial intelligence, a technology that might eventually exceed our capacity to control. These are not natural disasters. They're consequences of our success. Side effects of the same capabilities that allowed us to eliminate every competitor and dominate the planet. The traits that made us winners in the fight that lasted 2 million years. Our aggression, our competitiveness, our drive to control resources and eliminate rivals. These same traits now threaten to destroy us. We can't fight our way out of climate change. We can't outcompete a pandemic. We can't eliminate nuclear weapons by building more of them. The strategies that worked for 2 million years don't work anymore. The world has changed, and we have to change with it. Or we'll join Neanderthals, Denisovans, Paranthropus, and all the other human species in extinction. Another branch pruned from the tree. Another experiment that didn't quite work out. But here's the thing about humans. We can change. Not quickly, not easily, not without tremendous effort and setbacks and failures. But we can change. We've done it before. The same species that invented slavery also abolished it. The same species that created weapons of mass destruction also created treaties to limit them. The same species that drove countless animals to extinction also created conservation movements to protect the survivors. We're not locked into our evolutionary programming. We have culture. We have education. We have the capacity to recognize our worst impulses and choose differently. The fight that lasted 2 million years is over. We won. Or at least, we survived. But a new challenge has begun. Not a fight against other species, there are none left to fight. A fight against ourselves. Against the patterns that served us well in a world of scarcity and competition, but threaten us in a world where we are the dominant force. Can we transcend our evolutionary heritage? Can we build a civilization that doesn't just exploit resources until they're gone, but sustains them for future generations? Can we extend the empathy we feel for our immediate group to encompass all humans, all life, the planet itself? We don't know. We're the first species to face this challenge. There's no precedent, not just of the winners, but of all of them. Carrying Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan genes, the accumulated legacy of every lineage that merged with ours. The fight that lasted 2 million years didn't have a single victor. It had survivors. And those survivors carry within them the ghosts of everyone who came before. When you look in a mirror, you're not seeing just Homo sapiens. You're seeing the end result of millions of years of competition, cooperation, extinction, and merger. The face looking back at you contains traces of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly others we haven't identified yet. You are not one species. You are the last survivor of a family that once numbered dozens. The final chapter of a story that began when the first hominins stood upright and ended when we were the only ones left. What you do with that inheritance, what we do with it collectively, will determine whether the story continues or ends. The fight that lasted 2 million years is over. The real challenge is just beginning. The evidence. In 1924, a box of fossils arrived at the office of Raymond Dart, an anatomy professor in Johannesburg, South Africa. Dart was Australian by birth, trained in London, and newly arrived in South Africa. He was young, only 31, and ambitious. He had accepted the position in Johannesburg partly because he hoped Africa might yield important fossils. At the time, most scientists believed human evolution had occurred in Asia. The famous Java man, Homo erectus, had been discovered in Indonesia 3 decades earlier. Africa was an afterthought. The box came from a limestone quarry at a place called Tong, about 300 kilometers southwest of Johannesburg. Miners had been blasting rock, and occasionally found interesting things embedded in the stone. A colleague had asked them to save any unusual specimens. Most of the box's contents were unremarkable. Baboon skulls, mostly. Common fossils in South African caves. But one piece caught Dart's attention. It was a natural cast of a brain, an endocast, formed when sediment filled a skull and hardened. The brain shape was wrong for a baboon, too rounded, too large in certain areas. Dart searched through the remaining rocks and found another piece, a block of limestone with a face embedded in it. A small face, a child's face, but not quite human and not quite ape. For the next 73 days, Dart worked to free the skull from the surrounding rock. Using his wife's knitting needles, he carefully picked away the limestone grain by grain. When he finally finished, he was looking at the most important fossil discovery of the 20th century, the Taung child, a juvenile Australopithecus africanus, the first evidence that human evolution had occurred in Africa. The scientific establishment rejected Dart's claims almost universally. The skull was too ape-like, critics said. The child would have grown up to look like a chimpanzee. Africa couldn't be the cradle of humanity. Everyone knew humans had evolved in Asia, where Java man had been found. And besides, there was already a perfect human ancestor, Piltdown man, discovered in England in 1912. A skull with a human-sized brain and an ape-like jaw. Exactly what scientists expected a missing link to look like. Dart spent decades in the wilderness, defending a discovery that mainstream science refused to accept. He grew bitter, frustrated, increasingly isolated. But he was right. In 1953, Piltdown man was exposed as a fraud, a human skull combined with an orangutan jaw, deliberately aged to deceive. The ancestor that had seemed so perfect was a hoax. And suddenly, Dart's African ape child didn't look so implausible anymore. Through the 1950s and 1960s, more discoveries vindicated him. Robert Broom found adult Australopithecus specimens at Sterkfontein and Kromdraai. The Leakey family began their legendary work at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, uncovering a wealth of early human fossils. By the time Dart died in 1988, the African origin of humanity was scientific consensus. The Taung child was recognized as the breakthrough it had always been. But the path to that recognition had taken over 60 years. And it had required something that science doesn't like to admit it needs: patience, stubbornness, the willingness to be wrong for decades before being proven right. This is how we know what we know about the fight that lasted 2 million years. Not through revelation, not through sudden insight, through painstaking work in difficult places, by people willing to spend their careers on questions that might never be answered. Every claim in this documentary rests on evidence. Physical evidence. Bones pulled from the ground, dated through multiple methods, analyzed with technologies that didn't exist when they were discovered. But evidence doesn't interpret itself. The same bones can tell different stories, depending on who's reading them and what questions they're asking. The history of paleoanthropology is as much a story of changing interpretations as changing discoveries. To understand the fight that lasted 2 million years, we need to understand how we learned about it, the sites, the methods, the debates, the people who spent their lives digging in the African sun, trying to reconstruct a story that happened before stories existed. Olduvai Gorge cuts through the Serengeti Plain of Tanzania like a wound in the earth. 50 kilometers long, up to 90 meters deep, it exposes layer after layer of sediment deposited over the past 2 million years. Each layer is a snapshot of a different time, different climates, different animals, different hominins. The gorge was formed by geological activity along the East African Rift, the same forces that created the dramatic landscapes of Kenya and Ethiopia, the same forces that may have driven human evolution by constantly reshaping the environment our ancestors inhabited. But what makes Olduvai special isn't just its depth, it's its preservation. The sediments here include volcanic ash from ancient eruptions, ash that can be dated precisely using radiometric methods, ash that provides firm timestamps for everything found in the surrounding layers. When you find a hominin skull at Olduvai, you don't just know what it looked like, you know when it lived. Within a few tens of thousands of years, sometimes better. For events that happened 2 million years ago, that's remarkable precision. Lewis and Mary Leakey began working at Olduvai in 1931. For nearly 3 decades, they found stone tools by the thousands, but almost no hominin fossils. Year after year, they returned to the gorge, searching. Then, on July 17, 1959, Mary Leakey spotted fragments of bone eroding from a hillside. Fragments that turned out to be a skull. A massive skull, with a sagittal crest and enormous molars. Paranthropus boisei, the species they nicknamed Nutcracker Man. This was the discovery that changed everything. It proved that Olduvai contained hominin fossils, not just tools. It attracted funding that had been impossible to secure before. It launched the Leakey family into scientific celebrity. Over the following decades, the Leakeys and their teams recovered remains of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and multiple Paranthropus individuals. They documented stone tools spanning from the earliest Oldowan choppers to sophisticated Acheulean hand axes. They created a timeline of human evolution that researchers still use today. Olduvai became the reference point, the standard against which all other African sites were measured. When scientists wanted to understand what happened 2 million years ago, they started here. But Olduvai wasn't alone. Across East Africa, the Rift Valley was yielding treasures. Kubifora, on the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya. The Omo Valley in Ethiopia. Hadar, where Lucy was found. Each site contributed pieces to a puzzle that was slowly coming into focus. Kubifora deserves special attention. The site lies on the eastern shore of Lake Turkana, in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Water is scarce. The landscape is a maze of eroded badlands, beautiful and brutal. Richard Leakey, Lewis and Mary's son, began systematic work at Kubifora in 1968. Within a few years, his team had recovered more hominin fossils than any previous expedition in history. The numbers are staggering. Over 10,000 fossils cataloged, including hundreds of hominin specimens. Remains spanning from 4 million years ago to less than 1 million. Multiple species, multiple lineages, preserved in extraordinary detail. Among the most important finds, KNMER 1470, a skull discovered in 1972. It had a brain size of about 750 cubic centimeters, far larger than any Australopithecus. Its face was relatively flat, its features more human-like than anything of comparable age. Richard Leakey announced it as the oldest known member of our genus, Homo. The claim was controversial, the dating was uncertain, and some researchers thought the skull belonged to a late Australopithecus, but it sparked debates that continue today about when and how our genus emerged. KNMER 1813, another skull from Cubifora, complicated the picture further. Similar age to 1470, but much smaller brain. Were these two skulls from the same species, representing males and females? Or were there multiple Homo species living side by side? We still don't have definitive answers, but the questions themselves reveal how much the fossil record has taught us, and how much remains uncertain. The South African caves tell a different story than the East African rift sites. In the Rift Valley, fossils are preserved in open-air deposits, lake beds, river sediments, volcanic ash layers. The preservation is often fragmentary, but the dating is relatively straightforward. In South Africa, fossils come from caves, underground chambers that accumulated sediment and bone over hundreds of thousands of years. The preservation can be spectacular. Complete skeletons, articulated bones, details that weathering would have destroyed on the surface. But dating cave deposits is nightmarish. The sediments don't form neat horizontal layers. They slump, mix, get reworked by water and animals. The fossils themselves can't be dated directly by most radiometric methods. They're too old for radiocarbon, and the minerals needed for other techniques are often absent. For decades, South African fossils floated in a chronological limbo. We knew Australopithecus africanus was old, but we couldn't say how old with any precision. Was it contemporary with Lucy, or younger? Had it coexisted with early Homo, or preceded it? New dating techniques are slowly resolving these questions. Uranium-lead dating of flowstones, calcite layers that form in caves, can bracket the ages of fossil-bearing sediments. Paleomagnetism, the study of ancient magnetic fields preserved in rocks, provides additional constraints. The emerging picture is complex. Australopithecus africanus appears to span from roughly 3.3 to 2.1 million years ago. Paranthropus robustus overlapped with early Homo from about 2 million years ago until perhaps 1 million. The caves of South Africa preserve the same pattern of coexistence that we see in East Africa. But South Africa also preserves something unique. Evidence of what may have happened when those species met. Swartkrans is a cave about 40 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg. The site has been excavated since the 1940s, first by Robert Broom, later by C.K. Brain and others. The deposits span roughly 2 million to 1 million years ago, covering the critical period when Paranthropus and early Homo coexisted. Brain, yes, that was his actual name, spent decades analyzing the bone accumulations at Swartkrans. He wanted to understand how the fossils got there. Were these creatures living in the caves, dying in the caves, or being brought to the caves by something else? The answer, in many cases, was predators. Brain documented puncture marks on hominin skulls that matched the spacing of leopard canines. He found evidence that leopards had dragged their kills into trees overhanging the cave entrance, and the bones had fallen into the deposits below. Our ancestors weren't apex predators at Swartkrans. They were prey. But Brain found something else too. Bones with cut marks, stone tools, evidence that hominins weren't just being eaten, they were eating. Some of those cut-marked bones came from Paranthropus. The marks are unambiguous. They were made by stone tools, by someone butchering the carcass. Someone who possessed both tools and the knowledge to use them. That someone was almost certainly early Homo. We cannot say whether Homo killed Paranthropus or simply scavenged their bodies after natural deaths. We cannot say whether this was common or rare, systematic or opportunistic. The bones don't tell us intent, only action. But they tell us that, at least sometimes, one human species processed another human species for food. The fight that lasted 2 million years included, at minimum, this: the losers being eaten by the winners. The fossils are not our only evidence. Stone tools tell their own story, a story of technological change that tracks the cognitive evolution of our ancestors.
The earliest tools, the Lomequian, are crude almost beyond recognition. Rocks bashed against rocks, with minimal shaping. They date to 3.3 million years ago, predating our genus by hundreds of thousands of years. The Oldowan industry, beginning around 2.6 million years ago, represents an advance. Cores struck to produce sharp flakes. The flakes used for cutting, the cores for pounding. Simple but effective. Oldowan tools persist for over 1 million years with minimal change. This seems strange to us. Why didn't our ancestors improve their technology? Were they incapable of innovation? The answer is probably that the tools were good enough. They did what was needed. There was no pressure to make them better. Then, around 1.76 million years ago, something new appears: the Acheulean hand axe. Hand axes are different. They're shaped on both faces, bifacial, worked around the entire edge. They're symmetrical, often beautiful. Making one requires dozens of precise strikes, each one removing exactly the right amount of material. You can't make an Acheulean hand axe by accident. You can't make one without holding an image of the finished product in your mind. You can't make one without what psychologists call executive function, the ability to plan, to sequence actions, to delay gratification. Hand axes mark a cognitive threshold. Whoever made them thought differently than Oldowan toolmakers. They had crossed into a new kind of mind, and they kept making hand axes for over 1 million years. The same basic design, refined and elaborated, from Africa to Europe to India. The longest-lasting technology in human history. The tools tell us something else, too. They tell us who was making them. For a long time, the assumption was simple. Oldowan tools were made by Homo habilis. Acheulean hand axes were made by Homo erectus. Technology tracked species. Species tracked technology. But the evidence is messier than that. At some sites, Paranthropus fossils are found with Oldowan tools. Were they using the tools, making them, or just living alongside the makers? We don't know for certain. Paranthropus hands were capable of precision grip. Their fingers could have made stone tools. There's no anatomical reason they couldn't have been toolmakers. But their teeth tell a different story. Those massive molars, those powerful jaws, they were built to process food directly, to crack and grind and crush without technological assistance. Paranthropus had invested in biological solutions to the problem of eating. They had less need for tools than Homo did. The most likely scenario, both lineages were capable of making tools, but Homo was more dependent on them. Tools were optional for Paranthropus, essential for Homo. When you're dependent on something, you get better at it. You refine it. You innovate. This may be why Homo crossed the cognitive thresholds that Paranthropus didn't. Not because Homo was inherently smarter, but because Homo needed to be smarter. The tools created selection pressure for the minds that could make better tools. The past 2 decades have added an entirely new category of evidence: ancient DNA. Before the 1990s, studying the genetics of extinct species was science fiction. DNA degrades. It breaks down. After a few tens of thousands of years, it should be unreadable. But under the right conditions, cold, dry, stable, fragments of DNA can survive for much longer. And with new technologies, those fragments can be sequenced, analyzed, compared. The breakthrough came in 2010, when Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the first Neanderthal genome. Not a fragment, not a single gene, an entire genome, pieced together from bones that were over 40,000 years old. What they found was revolutionary. Neanderthals were not our ancestors in a direct line. They were cousins, a separate lineage that had diverged from ours roughly 500,000 years ago. They had evolved in Europe and Western Asia, while our ancestors evolved in Africa. But they weren't completely separate either, because the genome also showed something unexpected: gene flow, interbreeding. Neanderthals had contributed DNA to non-African modern humans. Between 1% and 4% of the genome of every European and Asian alive today comes from Neanderthal ancestors. The same year, Pääbo's team announced the discovery of Denisovans, a population known only from their DNA, extracted from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave. Denisovans had interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Their genetic legacy survives in modern Melanesians and, to a lesser extent, in East Asian populations. This was a complete rewriting of human history. The story wasn't replacement. It was replacement and assimilation, competition and interbreeding, a complex web of relationships that simple narratives couldn't capture. The DNA evidence also revealed something about the nature of these encounters. Analysis of Neanderthal Y chromosomes, the male inherited chromosome, showed something striking. Modern humans carry almost no Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA. The Neanderthal genetic contribution came almost entirely through female lineages. What does this mean? It could mean many things. Male hybrids could have been infertile, like mules. Neanderthal males could have been rejected as mates by Homo sapiens females. The interbreeding could have been asymmetric for social reasons. Or, and this is the darker interpretation, it could reflect violence. Homo sapiens males killing Neanderthal males and taking Neanderthal females. We cannot know for certain. The DNA tells us what happened, not how it happened. It tells us that genetic material moved between populations. It doesn't tell us whether that movement was consensual, coerced, or something in between. But given what we know about human behavior, given what we've done to each other throughout recorded history, the violent interpretation cannot be dismissed. The evidence is always incomplete. This is the fundamental limitation of paleoanthropology. We're reconstructing a story from fragments, bones that represent a tiny fraction of the individuals who lived, tools that preserve while the hands that made them decay, DNA that survives only in rare circumstances from rare locations, providing snapshots rather than video. For every fossil we've found, millions have been destroyed. By geology, by chemistry, by time. The record is biased towards certain environments, certain preservation conditions, certain lucky accidents. We work with what we have.
We build models that explain the evidence. We test those models against new discoveries. We revise, refine, sometimes abandon ideas that once seemed certain. This is science. Not certainty, but process. Not truth, but the best approximation of truth that evidence can support. The fight that lasted 2 million years is not a story we observed. It's a story we've reconstructed from clues scattered across a continent, from bones in caves and tools in sediments and DNA in fragments. We might be wrong about details. We're almost certainly wrong about some things we think we know. Future discoveries will revise current understanding, but the broad outlines are solid. The coexistence of multiple human species, the competition between them, the eventual dominance of one. These are not speculations. These are conclusions drawn from evidence accumulated over a century of research by thousands of scientists using methods of increasing sophistication. The story is true as any story about the distant past can be. And it matters, because understanding where we came from is essential to understanding what we are and what we might become. The weapons. A stone lies in your hand. It weighs perhaps half a kilogram. Smooth on one side, rough on the other. Gray, mottled with darker inclusions. Unremarkable. One of billions of similar stones scattered across the African landscape. Now imagine striking that stone against another. A precise blow, angled correctly, with exactly the right force. A flake detaches, thin, sharp, glinting in the sunlight. The edge is keener than any claw, any tooth, any natural cutting surface in existence. You have just created something that doesn't exist in nature. You have manufactured a tool. This act, this simple, seemingly primitive act, is the most consequential technology in the history of life on Earth. More important than fire, more important than agriculture, more important than writing, printing, or computers. Because this act changed what a body could do. It extended biological capability beyond biological limits. It began a process that would, over 2 million years, transform a vulnerable African ape into the dominant species on the planet. The weapons of the fight that lasted 2 million years were not muscles or teeth or claws. They were ideas made physical, thoughts turned into stone. Let's start at the beginning. Lomekwi 3, Kenya, 3.3 million years ago. The tools found here barely deserve the name. They're rocks that have been bashed against other rocks. The resulting fragments show minimal intentional shaping. If you found one on the ground, you might not recognize it as an artifact at all. But they are artifacts. Analysis of the fracture patterns proves it. These stones were struck deliberately, repeatedly, by someone who understood, at some level, that striking would produce useful fragments. Who made them? We don't know for certain. The leading candidates are Kenyanthropus platyops or late Australopithecus afarensis. Either way, the makers were not Homo. They were earlier hominins, with brains barely larger than a chimpanzee's. This is important. It tells us that tool manufacture didn't require a human brain, didn't require human intelligence. The basic concept, hit rocks together to make sharp things, was within the cognitive reach of creatures we would barely recognize as our relatives. But the Lomekwian tools didn't catch on. They appear in the record, then largely vanish. For hundreds of thousands of years afterward, stone tools are rare or absent in the archaeological record. Why didn't this technology spread? Why didn't it improve? Perhaps because it wasn't necessary. The makers had other options: teeth,
nails, found objects. The cognitive investment required to make and maintain stone tools wasn't worth it when simpler alternatives existed. Technology only spreads when it solves a problem that matters, when it provides an advantage significant enough to justify the cost of learning and using it. For the makers of Lamequian tools, apparently, it didn't. Then came the Oldowan. Around 2.6 million years ago, stone tools reappear, and this time they explode across the landscape. Sites in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, all yield the same basic technology: cores and flakes, choppers and scrapers. Simple but standardized. The timing is not coincidental. 2.6 million years ago is precisely when the first members of our genus, Homo, appear in the fossil record. It's also when African climate was shifting dramatically, when forests were shrinking and new survival strategies were needed. Oldowan tools solved a specific problem: accessing meat. A sharp flake can slice through hide that teeth cannot penetrate. It can sever tendons, separate joints, cut meat from bone. A heavy chopper can crack bones that jaws cannot break. Inside those bones, marrow, fat, concentrated calories that could fuel a growing brain. Without tools, our ancestors couldn't compete with carnivores. Lions, hyenas, leopards. They had the teeth, the claws, the strength to kill and butcher prey. Hominins had none of these. But with tools, the equation changed. Hominins couldn't kill large animals, not yet, but they could process carcasses. They could arrive after the predators had fed and extract resources that predators couldn't access. This was the original purpose of stone tools: not hunting, scavenging, exploiting a niche that no other animal could fill. The Oldowan toolkit was simple, but it wasn't primitive. Modern experiments have shown that making effective Oldowan tools requires skill. You need to select the right raw material, fine-grained stone that fractures predictably. You need to understand the geometry of fracture, how to strike at the correct angle to detach usable flakes. You need motor control, the ability to deliver precise blows with consistent force. None of this is instinctive. All of it must be learned. Chimpanzees can learn to crack nuts with stones. They've been doing it for thousands of years, maybe longer. But they cannot learn to make Oldowan tools. Researchers have tried to teach them. The chimps can understand the goal. They want the sharp flake, but they cannot master the technique. Their motor control isn't precise enough. Their understanding of fracture mechanics isn't sufficient. The Oldowan represents a cognitive threshold. Not a high threshold by modern standards, but a threshold nonetheless. Whoever made these tools thought differently than any ape before them, and they taught others. That's the crucial point. Oldowan technology wasn't reinvented at each site by independent geniuses. It was transmitted, passed from generation to generation, spread across thousands of kilometers over hundreds of thousands of years. This is culture. Primitive culture, yes, but culture. Socially transmitted knowledge that accumulates over time. The weapons of the fight that lasted 2 million years weren't just physical objects. They were information, knowledge encoded in brains and passed between them through observation, imitation, and teaching. For over 1 million years, Oldowan technology barely changed. This seems strange to us. We're accustomed to rapid technological change. The smartphone in your pocket is more powerful than computers that filled entire rooms 60 years ago. The idea that a technology could persist without significant improvement for 1 million years is almost incomprehensible. But remember, evolution doesn't pursue progress. It pursues adequacy. If a technology works well enough, there's no pressure to improve it. Innovation has costs: time, effort, risk of failure. If the existing tools do the job, why innovate? For Oldowan toolmakers, the existing tools did the job. They processed meat, cracked bones, scraped hides. They provided access to the calorie-dense foods that fueled larger brains. They were sufficient. Then, around 1.76 million years ago, something changed. At a site called Kokisele in Kenya, archaeologists found something new. Stone tools shaped on both faces, symmetrical, carefully worked around the entire perimeter. Acheulean hand axes had arrived. The Acheulean hand axe is one of the most. It's not particularly effective for chopping wood or digging tubers. Its shape doesn't optimize any single function. Some researchers argue that hand axes were multi-tools, Swiss Army knives of the Paleolithic, good enough at many tasks, even if not optimal for any one. Others suggest they were cores, sources of sharp flakes that could be struck off as needed. The teardrop shape might simply be what remained after useful flakes were removed. Still others propose that hand axes had social functions, that making a beautiful, symmetrical hand axe demonstrated skill, patience, cognitive capability, that hand axes were signals, advertisements of the maker's quality as a mate or ally. We don't know which interpretation is correct. Perhaps all of them contain some truth. But we do know this: making an Acheulean hand axe required a different kind of mind than making Oldowan tools. To make an Oldowan chopper, you strike a rock until you get useful flakes. The core is a byproduct. The goal is immediate: produce sharp edges, use them, discard them. To make an Acheulean hand axe, you must hold an image in your mind, the shape of the finished product, a template that guides your actions through dozens or hundreds of individual strikes. You must sequence those strikes correctly. Remove material in the right order. Adjust your approach as the shape develops. Plan many moves ahead, like a chess player seeing the board as it will be rather than as it is. You must manage impulse, the temptation to rush, to strike too hard, to remove too much material. One wrong blow can ruin hours of work. Patience isn't just helpful, it's essential. You must think abstractly. The hand axe in your hand isn't the hand axe in your mind. You're working toward an idea, a concept, a form that exists in imagination before it exists in stone. This is executive function, working memory, mental time travel, cognitive capabilities that Oldowan toolmakers may not have possessed. The Acheulean hand axe is a fossil of a mind, not just a tool, but evidence of the kind of thinking that made it possible. And who made these minds? Homo erectus. By 1.76 million years ago, Homo erectus had brains averaging around 900 cubic centimeters, nearly double the size of Homo habilis, approaching the lower range of modern humans. Their bodies were fully committed to ground-dwelling life: long legs, short arms, narrow hips. built for walking and running, not climbing. They had crossed a threshold. Whatever cognitive changes allowed Acheulean technology, Homo erectus possessed them, and they would dominate the hominin world for the next 1.5 million years. But here's the puzzle. Homo erectus coexisted with Paranthropus for hundreds of thousands of years. Both had access to the same raw materials. Both lived in the same environments. Both could, physically, have made the same tools. Yet Paranthropus never made Acheulean hand axes, never even adopted Oldowan technology in any substantial way. They remained toolless, or nearly so, while Homo erectus transformed stone into increasingly sophisticated instruments. Why? The answer probably lies in the different evolutionary investments of the two lineages. Paranthropus had invested in jaws, massive muscles, enormous teeth, skulls built around the machinery of mastication. Their solution to the problem of survival was biological. Their bodies were their tools. Homo had invested in brains, smaller jaws, weaker teeth, bodies that couldn't process tough foods without technological assistance. Their solution was cultural. Their tools were their tools. Neither strategy was inherently superior. Both worked. Both sustained viable populations for hundreds of thousands of years. But the brain and tool strategy had a hidden advantage. It could accelerate. Jaws improve through genetic evolution. That takes hundreds of generations, thousands of years for even small changes. Tools improve through cultural evolution. That can happen within a single lifetime. A single insight, shared and refined, can transform capabilities overnight. Paranthropus was racing in geological time. Homo was racing in cultural time. The outcome was inevitable. Not because Homo was better, but because Homo was faster. Fire is usually discussed as a separate technology, distinct from stone tools. But in the context of the fight that lasted 2 million years, fire was a weapon. Perhaps the most important weapon of all. When did hominins first control fire? This is one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. The evidence is ambiguous. Fire occurs naturally. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion of organic matter. Distinguishing natural fires from controlled fires in the archaeological record is extremely difficult. Some researchers argue for fire control as early as 1.5 million years ago, based on burned bones and discolored sediments at sites like Kubifora and Swartkrans. Others are skeptical, pointing out that natural fires, raw tubers are often toxic, full of defensive compounds that plants evolved to discourage being eaten. Raw seeds and nuts are hard to process, even with strong teeth. Cooking transforms all of these. Heat breaks down tough fibers, denatures proteins, destroys toxins. Cooked food yields more calories than raw food from the same source. The digestive system works less hard, freeing energy for other uses. Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooking was the crucial innovation in human evolution, that the extra calories from cooked food fueled the expansion of the energy-hungry human brain, that Homo erectus was, fundamentally, the cooking ape. The timing supports this. Homo erectus brains grew substantially after 1.5 million years ago, precisely when fire control may have begun. Their teeth and jaws shrank, exactly what you'd expect if food was being processed before eating rather than in the mouth. Cooking didn't just provide more energy. It changed what counted as food. Tubers that were poisonous raw became edible cooked. Meat that was too tough to chew became tender. The range of exploitable resources expanded dramatically, and Paranthropus couldn't follow. Their massive jaws were adaptations for processing raw, tough foods. If those foods could be softened by cooking, the jaws were no longer needed. The entire Paranthropus body plan became obsolete. It's oversimplified to say that fire killed Paranthropus. Climate change, habitat loss, and direct competition all played roles. But fire was part of the package. Part of the technological revolution that changed the rules of survival. Paranthropus had evolved to win a particular game. Homo had invented a new game entirely. Fire did more than provide calories. It extended the day. For millions of years, hominins had been prisoners of the sun. Active during daylight, hiding in darkness. Night belonged to predators, leopards, lions, hyenas, whose eyes and ears and noses made them masters of the dark. Fire created a bubble of safety, a zone of light where predators wouldn't venture, hours reclaimed from hiding, available for other activities. What did our ancestors do with those extra hours? We can't know for certain, but ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers provide clues. Night around the fire is social time, story time, time for conversation, for sharing information, for reinforcing social bonds. Language, or whatever communication system our ancestors possessed, may have developed or elaborated in firelit evenings. The cognitive demands of tracking complex social relationships, of sharing knowledge, of coordinating plans, these would have been amplified by the extended social time that fire provided. Fire was a tool for the mind, not just the body. And fire was a weapon in the most literal sense. Predators fear fire. The same instinct that keeps them away from forest fires keeps them away from campfires. A group of hominins with fire was no longer prey. They were something new, creatures that could claim space, defend territory, sleep on the ground without fear. Fire could be used offensively too, to drive game, to clear vegetation, to transform landscapes. Aboriginal Australians used fire to manage their environment for tens of thousands of years. Controlled burns promoted the growth of certain plants, attracted certain animals, created the mosaic landscapes that supported their way of life. This practice, fire stick farming, may have ancient roots. If Homo erectus was using fire, they were likely using it to modify their environment, to shape the world to their needs rather than simply responding to it. This is the essence of the Homo strategy. Not just adaptation to the environment, but adaptation of the environment, making the world fit us rather than waiting for us to fit the world. By 500,000 years ago, the hominin toolkit had expanded dramatically. Stone tools were more refined. Prepared core techniques, like the Levallois method, allowed knappers to produce standardized flakes with minimal waste. Blades appeared, long, thin flakes with parallel edges, more efficient and versatile than earlier forms. Wood was being shaped into spears. The oldest known wooden weapons, the Schöningen spears from Germany, date to around 300,000 years ago. 2 meters long, carefully balanced, hardened with fire. These weren't clubs or digging sticks. These were projectile weapons, made to be thrown at prey. The atlatl, the spear thrower, may have appeared around the same time, though direct evidence is limited. An atlatl extends the length of the arm, multiplying the speed and force of a thrown spear. It turns humans into something unprecedented, predators who can kill from a distance, beyond the reach of teeth and claws. Hafting, attaching stone points to wooden shafts, created composite tools. Tools with parts made from different materials, joined together into unified instruments. This required planning, foresight, knowledge of adhesives and binding techniques. The weapons were becoming more deadly, more efficient, more capable of projecting force across distance. And the species wielding these weapons were becoming more dangerous. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, around 300,000 years ago, the arms race was nearly over. We inherited everything our ancestors had developed: fire, stone tools, wooden weapons, hafting, projectiles. The accumulated technological heritage of 2 million years of innovation. And we added our own contributions. Bone tools, more delicate than stone, suitable for fine work. Fishing equipment, hooks, harpoons, nets, opening aquatic resources that earlier hominins had barely exploited. Sewing needles, allowing tailored clothing that could withstand extreme cold. By 70,000 years ago, modern human populations in Africa were producing blades of extraordinary refinement. Heat-treating stone to improve its fracture properties. Creating microliths, tiny blades set into wooden or bone handles to create compound cutting edges. This was technological sophistication that neither Neanderthals nor any other human species could match. Not because they lacked intelligence — Neanderthal brains were as large as ours — but because they lacked the social structures that transmitted and accumulated innovation. Innovation isn't just about individual genius. It's about population size, connectivity, transmission fidelity. A brilliant invention that isn't shared is lost when its inventor dies. An average invention that spreads through a connected population can build on itself, improve, become something extraordinary. Homo sapiens had larger social networks than Neanderthals, more connections between groups, better mechanisms for transmitting information across generations. Our weapons weren't better because our minds were better. They were better because our cultures were better. Because we had built systems for preserving and improving knowledge that our competitors hadn't matched. When Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthals around 45,000 years ago, the technological gap was decisive. Neanderthals had their own sophisticated tools. The Mousterian industry, refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They had fire. They had wooden spears. They had survived ice ages that would have destroyed lesser species. But they didn't have what we had. They didn't have atlatls that could kill from 20 meters away. They didn't have bow and arrow, which may have appeared shortly after the encounter. They didn't have fishing equipment that could exploit coastal resources year-round. They didn't have the social networks that could concentrate hundreds of individuals when needed, that could coordinate hunting drives across kilometers, that could share information about distant resources, distant dangers, distant opportunities. They were fighting a war with the weapons of the previous era against an enemy equipped with weapons of the future. The outcome wasn't certain. Nothing in evolution ever is. But the odds were heavily tilted. And within 5,000 years of contact, Neanderthals were gone. The weapons of the fight that lasted 2 million years weren't just tools. They were extensions of cognition, physical manifestations of mental capabilities. externalizations of knowledge that could accumulate across generations. A hand axe isn't just a piece of shaped stone, it's a fossil of understanding. Understanding of fracture mechanics, of geometry, of planning and patience. It's proof that its maker could hold an image in mind and work toward it over hours or days. A fire isn't just combustion, it's evidence of control. Control over a natural process, over time, over space. It's proof that its users could think beyond immediate needs, could prepare for futures that hadn't happened yet. A thrown spear isn't just a projectile. It's proof that its thrower understood physics intuitively, trajectory, momentum, timing. Proof that human cognition could model the world accurately enough to act at a distance. Every weapon was a theory, a hypothesis about how the world worked, a bet that certain actions would produce certain outcomes. And every successful weapon was a confirmed theory, a bet that paid off. A piece of knowledge that could be transmitted, refined, built upon. This is what made Homo different. Not any single weapon, but the capacity to make weapons. To externalize cognition into physical form. To accumulate understanding across generations. The arms race that began 3.3 million years ago, with crude stones bashed together in Kenya, led inexorably to this. A species that could shape the world to its will, that could kill any animal, exploit any resource, survive any environment. A species that had become, through technology, something new under the sun. The most dangerous animal that ever lived. The mines. Somewhere in a cave in Indonesia, around 45,000 years ago, someone pressed their hand against a wall. They placed their palm flat against the limestone. With the other hand, or perhaps with their mouth, they sprayed pigment. Red ochre mixed with water, blown through a hollow reed or directly from pursed lips. When they pulled their hand away, a negative image remained, a silhouette. The outline of a human hand, preserved in mineral pigment on stone. That handprint is still there today. In the caves of Sulawesi, alongside images of pigs and dwarf buffalo, the oldest known hand stencils in the world survive as testament to a moment of creation. But what was that moment exactly? A handprint isn't useful. It doesn't help you find food, avoid predators, attract mates, or raise children. It serves no practical function whatsoever. And yet, someone made it. Someone took time away from survival to press pigment against stone, creating an image that would outlast them by tens of thousands of years. Why? This question, why did humans begin making art, is really a question about something deeper, about the cognitive revolution that separated Homo sapiens from every other species that has ever existed, about the kind of mind that could conceive of such an act and find it meaningful. Because that handprint isn't just an image, it's a statement, a declaration of existence, a way of saying, I was here, I existed, I mattered. No other animal has ever made such a statement. No Neanderthal, no Denisovan, no Homo erectus, despite their large brains and sophisticated tools, ever felt the need to mark their presence in this way. Only us, only Homo sapiens. The question is, why? Let's be precise about what we mean by cognitive revolution. It's not that Homo sapiens were the first intelligent hominins. Intelligence had been evolving for millions of years. Homo erectus was intelligent enough to control fire and spread across 3 continents. Neanderthals were intelligent enough to survive ice ages and care for disabled individuals. The cognitive revolution wasn't about intelligence in general. It was about a specific kind of cognition, a specific capacity that appeared,
or reached full expression in Homo sapiens and apparently no other species. The capacity to imagine things that don't exist. This sounds simple. It isn't. Consider what it means to imagine something that doesn't exist. Not just to remember the past or perceive the present, but to conceive of alternatives, possibilities, counterfactuals, things that could be but aren't, things that have never been but might be. This is the foundation of everything that makes humans unique. Language, art, religion, science, technology beyond the simplest tools. All of it depends on the ability to represent, manipulate, and communicate things that exist only in the mind. A Neanderthal could see a deer and think, food, could remember where deer had been found before, could plan how to approach and kill this particular deer. But could a Neanderthal imagine a deer god? A spirit of the hunt that must be propitiated with ritual. A mythological deer ancestor from whom all deer, and perhaps all humans, descended? We don't know. We have no evidence that they could. And the absence of evidence, in this case, may be significant. The archaeological record of Homo sapiens, beginning around 100,000 years ago, shows something that no other hominin record shows: symbolic behavior. Symbols are representations. They stand for something other than themselves. A word is a symbol, a sound pattern that refers to a concept. A religious icon is a symbol, a physical object that represents a spiritual reality. A nation's flag is a symbol, a piece of colored cloth that represents collective identity. Using symbols requires a particular cognitive architecture. You must be able to hold two things in mind simultaneously: the symbol and what it represents. You must understand that the relationship between them is arbitrary, that there's no necessary connection between the sound tree and the object it describes, or between a crucifix and the theology it embodies. This is called symbolic cognition, or fully modern cognition, and it appears to be unique to Homo sapiens. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Personal ornaments, beads, pendants, objects worn for decoration rather than function, appear in African archaeological sites around 100,000 years ago. Shell beads at Blombos Cave in South Africa. Ochre crayons apparently used for body decoration. Objects whose only purpose was to communicate something about their wearer. What were they communicating? We can't know for certain, but ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest possibilities. Group membership, social status, religious affiliation, personal identity. All of these are communicated through adornment in every human society we've ever studied. To make and wear a bead, you must understand that others will see it and interpret it, that the bead will say something about you, that you can manipulate what it says by choosing which beads to wear. This is symbolic communication. This is language without words. Then there's art. The caves of Europe, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, contain images that still astonish 30,000 years after they were made. Horses in motion, lions hunting, bison rendered with such accuracy that paleontologists use the paintings to understand Pleistocene ecosystems. But Europe doesn't have the oldest art. That distinction belongs to Indonesia, and increasingly to Africa. The Sulawesi caves contain figurative art, recognizable images of animals, dating to at least 45,000 years ago. That's older than any European cave painting. It means that artistic behavior didn't develop in Europe and spread outward. It was already present in the populations that colonized Europe and Southeast Asia. In Africa, abstract engravings, geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines appear even earlier. The Blombos ochre, with its carved patterns, dates to around 77,000 years ago. Is this art? Is it writing? Is it something else entirely? We don't know what these patterns meant, but we know they meant something. They weren't accidental. They weren't functional in any obvious way. They were deliberate marks, made by minds that thought in symbols. And then there's language. Language is the ultimate symbolic system. An infinite array of meanings expressed through finite combinations of sounds. The ability to discuss the past, the future, the hypothetical. To tell stories. To lie. To ask questions about questions. When did language evolve? This is one of the most difficult questions in human origins research. Language doesn't fossilize. We can't examine the conversations of our ancestors the way we examine their bones and tools. But we can make inferences. The anatomical prerequisites for speech, the descended larynx, the fine motor control of the tongue and lips, the brain structures that process linguistic information, these appear to have evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years.
Homo erectus may have had some capacity for vocalization. Neanderthals almost certainly did. Their hyoid bones, the small bones in the throat that support speech, are essentially identical to ours. But anatomical capacity isn't the same as full language. A parrot can mimic human speech without understanding it. The question isn't whether early hominins could make sounds. It's whether they could use symbols, arbitrary sounds linked to arbitrary meanings, in a system of infinite combination. The best evidence suggests that full symbolic language is a recent development. The archaeological explosion of behavioral modernity, art, ornaments, complex tools, long-distance trade, coincides with a genetic and neural reorganization that may have enabled true language. Some researchers point to a gene called FOXP2, which is involved in the fine motor control required for speech and appears to have been under strong selection in recent human evolution. Others point to changes in brain structure, the expansion of Broca's area, the elaboration of connections between brain regions that appear unique to Homo sapiens. Whatever the mechanism, the result is clear. Homo sapiens developed a communication system of unprecedented power, a system that could transmit not just information about the present, but about the absent, the past, the future, the imaginary. This changed everything. Why does imagination matter? Consider what you can do with a mind that imagines. You can plan. Not just react to current circumstances, but anticipate future ones. Not just solve problems that exist, but prevent problems that might exist. You can cooperate at scale, not just with individuals you know personally, but with strangers who share your beliefs, your identity, your imagined community. 100 people who have never met can work together toward a common goal if they share a common story. You can accumulate knowledge, not just learn from personal experience, but learn from the experiences of others, including others who died long before you were born. The wisdom of ancestors, encoded in stories and rituals, transmitted across generations without loss. You can innovate, not just tinker with existing solutions, but conceive entirely new approaches. Ask what if, and follow the implications wherever they lead. Every one of these capabilities depends on symbolic cognition, on the ability to represent, manipulate, and communicate things that exist only in minds. And every one of these capabilities gave Homo sapiens advantages that other hominins didn't have. Let's return to the comparison with Neanderthals. Neanderthals had large brains, as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They survived in environments that would have killed most species. They were not stupid. They were not primitive. They were intelligent, adaptable, successful hominins who dominated Europe and Western Asia for 400,000 years. But their archaeological record shows something striking: stasis. Neanderthal technology changed slowly. Over hundreds of thousands of years, their tools remained fundamentally similar. Mousterian points, Levallois flakes. Effective, refined, but not revolutionary. Compare this to Homo sapiens. In the 50,000 years since we arrived in Europe, we've gone from stone tools to smartphones, from campfires to nuclear reactors, from walking to spaceflight. The difference isn't intelligence. The difference is accumulation. Homo sapiens accumulated innovations in ways that Neanderthals apparently couldn't. Each generation built on the achievements of the previous one. Improvements were preserved, transmitted, combined. This ratchet effect, the tendency for culture to build on itself, depends on several factors. Population size matters. More people means more potential innovators. Connectivity matters. Innovations must spread to persist. Transmission fidelity matters. Information must be passed accurately from teacher to learner. But perhaps most importantly, symbolic communication matters. Complex ideas can only be transmitted through symbolic language. The subtleties of technique, the reasons behind practices, the contexts in which methods work or fail. These require the precision that only language provides. Neanderthals may have had language of some kind, but if their language was less precise, less flexible, less capable of expressing abstract concepts, then their cultural transmission would have been less effective. Innovations would have been lost more easily. The ratchet would have slipped. This is speculative. We cannot know what Neanderthal communication was like, but something explains the difference in cultural accumulation. Something made Homo sapiens cultures build on themselves, while Neanderthal cultures remained largely static. That something was probably related to symbolic cognition, to the kinds of minds we have, and they apparently didn't. There's another possibility, one that's harder to test, but potentially more important. Maybe the difference wasn't cognitive capacity. Maybe it was cognitive style. Neanderthals lived in small groups, perhaps 15 to 25 individuals, based on genetic evidence suggesting low population density and high inbreeding. They ranged over limited territories, exploiting familiar resources in familiar ways. Homo sapiens lived differently. Our African ancestors formed larger groups. This requires social intelligence, but not necessarily symbolic abstraction. In a large, fluid network, you need something more. You need to categorize people quickly. Friend or foe, trustworthy or not, same group or different. You need to communicate across groups with people who don't share your entire context. You need to represent identity in ways that transcend personal acquaintance. This is where symbols become essential. A shared language, a shared religion, a shared set of markers. These allow coordination among strangers. They create the imagined communities,
that anthropologists recognize in every human society. Maybe Homo sapiens didn't have better brains than Neanderthals. Maybe we had brains adapted to a different social ecology, an ecology that demanded symbolic representation as a survival tool. And when Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, bringing our social structures and symbolic systems with us, we encountered Neanderthals who had evolved for a different kind of social world. The encounter wasn't just between two species. It was between two ways of being intelligent, two strategies for using cognition to survive. One of those strategies scaled. The other didn't. What was it like to be a Neanderthal? This is a question we can never fully answer, but it's worth asking because it illuminates what makes our own minds distinctive. Neanderthals experienced the world. They felt pain and pleasure, fear and comfort. They cared for injured individuals, sometimes for years. They buried at least some of their dead, which suggests some form of emotional response to mortality. They planned. They ambushed large prey, which requires anticipation and coordination. They prepared tools in advance, which requires foresight. They knew their environments intimately. Every valley, every water source, every seasonal change. Knowledge accumulated over lifetimes, essential for survival.
But did they tell stories? Did they have myths? Did they imagine their ancestors watching from some other realm, judging their actions, guiding their choices? Did they dream of places they had never been, invent creatures that never existed, wonder what happened before the oldest memories? Did they know they were going to die? And if they knew, did they imagine what might come after? These are the questions that separate practical intelligence from symbolic cognition, the questions that define the boundary between mind and mind. We cannot answer them for Neanderthals, but the absence of art, the absence of ornaments, the absence of the symbolic explosion that characterizes Homo sapiens, this absence is suggestive. Maybe Neanderthal minds were brilliant but bounded, powerful but present-focused, intelligent without being imaginative. If so, they inhabited a different mental world than we do, a world without abstraction, without mythology, without the endless what-ifs that torment and inspire us. In some ways, that world might have been more peaceful, more grounded, less anxious, but it was also more limited, less capable of the cumulative innovation that would transform the planet. And when our two kinds of minds met, the outcome was already determined, not by strength, not by numbers, not even by tools, by the capacity to imagine a future and work collectively toward it. The cognitive revolution didn't happen all at once. The archaeological record shows a gradual accumulation of symbolic behaviors in Africa between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Shell beads, ochre processing, geometric engravings, long-distance exchange of valuable materials. Then, around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, something accelerated. The behaviors became more elaborate, more frequent, more widespread. Populations expanded out of Africa, carrying symbolic culture with them. What caused the acceleration? Several theories compete. Some researchers propose a genetic mutation, a change in brain wiring that enabled full symbolic thought. This great leap forward theory suggests a single event that transformed cognition and triggered the cultural explosion. Others argue for a more gradual process. Population growth, they suggest, crossed a threshold around 70,000 years ago. Larger populations meant more innovation, more preservation of innovation, more building on previous achievements. The explosion was demographic, not genetic. Still others point to environmental pressure. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia erupted, triggering a volcanic winter that may have reduced human populations to a few thousand individuals. The survivors, this theory suggests, were those with the most advanced cognitive and cultural capabilities, a bottleneck that selected for symbolic minds. We don't know which theory is correct. Perhaps elements of all three contributed. But the result is clear. By 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was cognitively modern, capable of everything we are capable of today. The same kinds of minds that would eventually build cities, write symphonies, and land on the moon were already walking the savannas of Africa and the forests of Southeast Asia. Those minds were about to encounter their relatives, and their relatives were about to disappear. The cognitive revolution was the ultimate weapon. Not because it produced better spears or more efficient hunting techniques, though it did both of those things, but because it produced something more fundamental, the ability to coordinate at scale. A Neanderthal band of 25 individuals could defend their territory against another band of 25. The numbers were roughly equal. The technologies were roughly equal. The outcome would depend on local factors, terrain, luck, the specific individuals involved. But what if one side could mobilize 200 individuals? What if they could coordinate hunters from multiple bands, converging on a target from multiple directions? What if they could share intelligence about enemy movements across a network of allied groups? No Neanderthal band could withstand that. No matter how strong their individuals, no matter how sophisticated their local technology, they would be overwhelmed by numbers and coordination. And Homo sapiens could do this. Our symbolic cognition allowed us to form alliances with people we had never met, to identify friends and enemies based on shared markers, language, ritual, adornment, to create the us and them that makes large-scale cooperation possible. This was the weapon that won the fight that lasted 2 million years. Not any physical technology, but a social technology. The ability to scale cooperation beyond the local group. It was devastating in competition with other human species. It would prove even more devastating when we turned it on ourselves. There's a dark side to symbolic cognition. The same capacity that allows us to form large cooperative groups also allows us to define outgroups, to categorize some humans as less than human, to treat them as enemies, as resources, as obstacles to be eliminated. Throughout history, this capacity has been weaponized. The symbols that unite one group mark another group as alien. The stories that give meaning to one people demonize another. The very power of imagination that allowed us to outcompete Neanderthals has been turned again and again against subsets of our own species. Maybe this is what happened to the Neanderthals. Maybe they weren't just outcompeted. Maybe they were categorized, defined as other, treated as less than human by creatures who had developed the cognitive apparatus to make such distinctions. We'll never know for certain, but the pattern is familiar, disturbingly familiar. The minds that gave us art and language and science also gave us xenophobia and genocide. The capacity for abstraction that let us coordinate across thousands became the capacity to dehumanize across categories. The cognitive revolution was a package deal. We got the benefits and the costs together. and we're still living with both. In a cave in France around 30,000 years ago, someone crawled deep underground, past the entrance chambers where people lived, past the areas of light and warmth, into passages that required crawling, squeezing, navigating in total darkness. And there, in a chamber that had never seen daylight, they made art. Lions, horses, rhinos, rendered with skill and care in a place where no one would see them, a place that required extraordinary effort just to reach. Why? We don't know. We can't know. The artists left no written explanation, and their descendants, if they had any, are separated from us by too many generations to maintain oral tradition. But we can guess. The art wasn't meant for everyday viewing. It wasn't decoration. It was something else. Something sacred, perhaps. Something that connected the visible world to invisible realities. Something that required darkness and difficulty and the sensation of being deep within the earth. This is religious behavior, ritual behavior, behavior that makes no practical sense but serves psychological and social functions that are deeply, characteristically human. Neanderthals never did this. Neither did Homo erectus. Neither did any other species on Earth. Only us. Only the minds that could imagine things that don't exist and treat those imaginings as real. The cognitive revolution gave us the capacity for religion, for meaning, for the conviction that our brief lives matter in some cosmic sense. Whether that conviction is true, whether there's really anything out there that cares about the marks we make on cave walls, that's a question beyond science to answer. But the conviction itself is real. It's part of what makes us human, part of the cognitive architecture that won the fight that lasted 2 million years. We are the species that tells itself stories, and those stories made us powerful beyond anything evolution had produced before. The question now is whether we're wise enough to tell the right stories. The Last Stand. Gibraltar, 32,000 years ago. The rock rises from the sea like a fist, a limestone fortress at the southern tip of Iberia, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic. Caves honeycomb its faces, Gorham's Cave, Vanguard Cave, others without modern names. Shelter from wind, access to both marine and terrestrial resources. A defensible position in an increasingly hostile world. This is where they made their last stand. Not a battle, not a siege, not anything so dramatic or quick. Just a slow retreat, stretched across millennia. A gradual contraction of range, of numbers, of possibilities, until finally there was only this: a few hundred individuals, perhaps fewer, clinging to the edge of a continent that no longer had room for them. The last Neanderthals. They didn't know they were the last. They couldn't know. They were simply living as their ancestors had lived for 400,000 years, hunting, gathering, raising children, burying their dead, doing what Neanderthals had always done. But the world had changed, and they hadn't changed with it. We can reconstruct their final centuries from the archaeological record at Gibraltar. The caves show continuous occupation spanning tens of thousands of years. Layer upon layer of debris, ash from fires, bones from meals, tools from daily work. The Neanderthals who lived here weren't starving refugees. They were successful hunters, exploiting a rich environment that offered both land mammals and marine resources. They ate ibex, the wild goats that still live on Mediterranean cliffs, red deer, wild boar, rabbits. They collected mussels and limpets from the shore. They hunted seals when opportunity arose. They even took dolphins, somehow. We don't know how, but the bones are there. Their tools were sophisticated, not the crude implements of popular imagination, but carefully crafted points and scrapers. They made fire. They processed hides. They did everything that successful Pleistocene hunters were supposed to do. And yet, around 42,000 years ago, something changed in the deposits at Gorham's Cave. New artifacts appeared alongside the traditional Mousterian tools. Artifacts that don't match Neanderthal technology. Artifacts that look like the aurignation industry of early modern humans. The newcomers had arrived. We don't know if they met. The evidence is ambiguous. The archaeological layers are compressed. Dating precision isn't fine enough to determine whether Neanderthals and modern humans occupied the caves simultaneously, sequentially, or in alternating phases. But they were close. Geographically close, temporally close. In the same landscape, exploiting the same resources, within generations of each other, if not within years. What happens when two human species share a landscape? We have one analog in recent history, the encounter between indigenous peoples and colonizers. And we know how those encounters typically went. Competition for resources, territorial displacement, violence, disease, and demographic collapse. The power differential between Neanderthals and modern humans wasn't as extreme as between, say, indigenous Australians and British colonizers. Neanderthals had sophisticated technology. They knew the land. They were physically stronger than modern humans. But they had disadvantages too. Smaller populations, less extensive networks, possibly less flexible cognition, certainly less ability to concentrate forces when needed. If there was conflict, and there probably was, given what we know about human nature, then the Neanderthals would have lost. Not every skirmish, not every encounter, but the overall trend would have been clear. Retreat, contraction, loss. The genetic evidence tells part of the story. Neanderthal genetic diversity was already low before modern humans arrived. Generations of small population sizes had eroded variation. Inbreeding was common. Analysis of Neanderthal genomes shows signs of mating between close relatives. This is what extinction looks like from inside. Not sudden catastrophe, but slow erosion. Each generation slightly smaller than the last. Each local population more isolated than before. Each lineage more vulnerable to the accidents and diseases that can eliminate small groups. Modern humans, by contrast, were expanding. Their genetic diversity was increasing. New territory meant new resources, meant larger populations, meant more genetic variation. The two species were moving in opposite directions, one ascending, one descending. The intersection point was extinction. Did modern humans kill the last Neanderthals? Some researchers think so. The timing is suggestive. Neanderthals disappeared from each region within a few thousand years of modern human arrival. That's too consistent to be coincidence, too quick to be simple competition. Direct violence is one possibility. Hunting parties that targeted Neanderthal bands, systematic elimination of competitors. Warfare, essentially, even if the participants wouldn't have recognized the concept. But there are other possibilities. Disease.
Modern humans coming from Africa carried pathogens that Neanderthals had never encountered. Populations that had been isolated for 400,000 years would have had no immunity to diseases that modern humans had evolved to resist. A single epidemic could devastate communities. Resource competition without direct violence. Modern humans were more efficient hunters, or more effective at exploiting diverse resources. They took the best territories, leaving Neanderthals with marginal lands that couldn't support viable populations. Reproductive competition. Modern humans were expanding. They needed mates. If modern human males took Neanderthal females, whether through choice, coercion, or capture, they would have reduced Neanderthal reproductive capacity while boosting their own. The genetic evidence supports this last possibility. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, but it came predominantly through female Neanderthal lineages. Neanderthal Y chromosomes are almost entirely absent from modern genomes. This is consistent with a pattern of modern human males mating with Neanderthal females, but not the reverse. Was this consensual? Was it coerced? Were Neanderthal women choosing modern human mates, or were they being taken? We can't know. The DNA tells us what happened, not how it felt. But given what we know about human behavior in analogous situations, the treatment of conquered peoples throughout recorded history, the darker interpretations cannot be dismissed. Imagine being among the last. Your grandparents told stories of a larger world, more people, more bands, gatherings where dozens of families came together, where mates could be found, where knowledge was exchanged. Your parents saw that world contract. Bands that used to visit stopped coming. Territories that used to be safe became dangerous. Strange people appeared on the horizon. People who looked wrong, moved wrong, spoke in sounds that made no sense. Now there's only your band, a few dozen individuals.
You haven't seen another Neanderthal outside your group in years. When someone dies, there's no one to replace them. When children are born, there aren't enough unrelated mates for them to choose from. You don't know you're the last. You don't have that concept. You just know that things are harder than they used to be, that the world is emptier, that the future feels smaller than the past. And then, one season, the strangers appear again. More of them this time, moving with purpose, looking at your territory with hunger in their eyes. What do? You fight, or you flee, or you try to negotiate, try to find some accommodation that lets both groups survive. But the numbers are against you. The networks are against you. The entire momentum of history is against you. And eventually, you're gone. The last Neanderthal died sometime around 28,000 to 30,000 years ago. We don't know their name. We don't know their age or sex. We don't know if they died alone or surrounded by family, in peace or in violence, aware of their significance or oblivious to it. We know almost nothing about them as an individual, but we know what their death meant: the end of a lineage that stretched back 400,000 years, the termination of an experiment in humanity that had survived ice ages, climate shifts, volcanic winters, and every other challenge the Pleistocene could offer. Everything except us. The Neanderthals weren't alone in their extinction. Across Asia, the Denisovans were disappearing too. We know even less about their end than we do about the Neanderthals. A few bones, a few fragments of DNA. Almost nothing about their culture, their lives, or their deaths. They had spread across a vast territory, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, based on the genetic traces they left in modern populations. They had adapted to high altitudes. They had survived in environments ranging from subarctic cold to tropical heat. And then they were gone. The timing, again, correlates with modern human expansion. As Homo sapiens spread across Asia, Denisovan populations contracted and disappeared. The last Denisovans probably survived longer than the last Neanderthals, perhaps until 30,000 or even 20,000 years ago in isolated refugia. But they too fell silent. They too left only bones and genes behind. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, a different story played out. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits, had been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. They had evolved in their own direction, shrinking to cope with island resources, developing their own tools and hunting strategies. For most of their existence, they had no competition. They were the only hominins on Flores, the only intelligent beings on their small island world. Then, modern humans arrived. We don't have direct evidence of contact. The archaeological record isn't detailed enough. But the timing is again suggestive. Homo floresiensis disappears from the fossil record around 50,000 years ago, precisely when modern humans were colonizing the Indonesian archipelago. What happened? Competition for resources is the likely answer. Modern humans were more efficient hunters, more effective at exploiting the island's limited carrying capacity. There wasn't room for two hominin species, and when resources ran short, the species with larger social networks, more flexible technology, and faster cultural adaptation won. The hobbits had survived for hundreds of thousands of years in isolation. They survived for perhaps a few generations in the presence of Homo sapiens. Then they were gone. The pattern repeats everywhere. In Africa, late surviving archaic populations, sometimes called archaic Homo sapiens, or assigned to species like Homo naledi, disappeared around the same time modern humans were expanding. The timing varies by region, but the outcome is consistent. In China, the last Homo erectus populations vanished. They had survived for over 1 million years, longer than any other human species outside Africa. They had adapted to environments from tropical to temperate, from coastal to highland, but they couldn't adapt to us. By 30,000 years ago, it was over. For the first time in 2 million years, there was only one human species on Earth, Homo sapiens, us. We had inherited a planet, a world emptied of competitors, a world where every ecological niche that hominins could fill was now filled by one species alone. This wasn't the natural order of things. For 95% of hominin history, multiple human species had coexisted. The single-species world we live in today is an anomaly, a recent development, a consequence of events that happened in the last 1% of our evolutionary history. We made that world. Whether through violence, competition, assimilation, or some combination of all three, we made a world with no alternatives, no other ways of being human. The last stand of the Neanderthals at Gibraltar was not just their ending. It was the ending of something larger, the closing of an era of human diversity that had lasted longer than any civilization, longer than any culture, longer than anything we would recognize as history. When they disappeared, part of the human story disappeared with them, and we are left to wonder what might have been. What if they had survived? This is the question that haunts the story, the counterfactual that shadows every fact. What if Neanderthals had held on in their refugia? What if they had adapted, as they had adapted to so many challenges before? What if Gibraltar had remained a sanctuary, a pocket of alternative humanity that persisted into the modern era? How would we have treated them? This is the uncomfortable question, the one that forces us to confront what we are and what we've done. Would we have recognized them as human, as people with rights, with dignity, with claims to territory and self-determination? The historical record suggests not. Throughout recorded history, we have treated human groups that differed from us as less than human, as savages to be civilized, resources to be exploited, obstacles to be eliminated. If we did this to members of our own species, to people who were genetically, cognitively, and culturally almost identical to us, what would we have done to Neanderthals? To beings who looked different, thought differently, and couldn't fully participate in our symbolic systems? Would there be Neanderthal reservations, Neanderthal zoos, Neanderthal slaves? Or would we have finished the job our ancestors started? Would the last Neanderthals have survived into the 20th century only to be exterminated by modern technology, modern logistics, modern capacity for organized violence? We can't know. The counterfactual is unfalsifiable. But asking the question reveals something important about ourselves. The extinction of the Neanderthals wasn't just something that happened. It was something we did. Something our ancestors did with tools and minds that we inherited. We are the descendants of the winners. We carry the genes of the survivors. Everything we are is built on a foundation of victory in a war we didn't choose and don't remember. But the war happened, and the losers, all of them, Neanderthals and Denisovans, and Floresiensis, and Erectus, and all the rest, are gone because of us. There's one more thing. They're not entirely gone. Not completely. Every person of European or Asian descent carries Neanderthal DNA. Every Melanesian carries Denisovan DNA. The extinct species live on, fragmented and dispersed, in the genomes of their conquerors. When you look in a mirror, you're seeing Neanderthal eyes, Neanderthal skin, Neanderthal immune system components that help you fight diseases today. The war that lasted 2 million years didn't end with complete extermination. It ended with absorption, with merger, with the genetic legacy of the losers preserved inside the winners. This is not redemption. It doesn't make up for what was lost. But it means that the story isn't only about destruction. It's also about continuation, about genetic threads that connect us to relatives we never knew we had. The last Neanderthals at Gibraltar probably had children. Not Neanderthal children, perhaps, but hybrid children. Children who carried their genes forward into the modern human population. In that sense, they didn't lose. Not entirely. Not permanently. Their lineage ended, Their culture ended. Their way of being human ended. But something of them survived. Something of them is still here, distributed across billions of people who never knew their names. The caves at Gibraltar are tourist attractions now. You can take a ferry from Spain, see the famous rock, visit the caves where the last Neanderthals lived. The guides will tell you about the archaeology, the dating, the evidence of final occupation. They'll show you the view from the cave mouth, the Mediterranean stretching to the horizon, Africa visible on clear days, impossibly close. And if you're paying attention, you might feel something, a sense of standing at an ending, a boundary between eras, a threshold that once crossed could never be uncrossed. The last Neanderthals saw this view.
30,000 years ago, in conditions not so different from today, they stood where tourists stand now and looked out at a world that was slipping away from them. They couldn't know what was happening. They couldn't understand that they were the last, that their kind would never return, that the strangers in the north were the future, and they were the past. They just lived, as best they could, for as long as they could, in the only home they had left. And then they died, and the caves fell silent, and 2 million years of coexistence came to an end. We are what remains. The ghosts in our DNA. In 1856, workers quarrying limestone in the Neander Valley near Düsseldorf, Germany, discovered bones. They weren't looking for fossils. They were looking for limestone to make cement. The bones were an inconvenience. Strange, heavy-browed fragments that didn't look quite human, but didn't look quite animal either. The workers almost threw them away, but someone thought to save them. Someone brought them to a local teacher named Johann Karl Fuhlrott, who recognized that they were something unusual. Fuhlrott showed them to anatomist Hermann Schaffhausen. Together, they announced the discovery of an ancient human, a representative of a barbarous and savage race that had lived in Europe long before recorded history. They named the specimen after the valley where it was found, Neanderthal, the Valley of the Neander, a name that would become synonymous with primitiveness, with brutishness, with everything we imagined we had evolved beyond. For 150 years, Neanderthals remained bones, objects to be measured, classified, debated. We could describe their skulls, their limbs, their teeth. We could speculate about their lives. But they were fundamentally alien, separated from us by an unbridgeable gulf of time. Then, in the 1990s, something changed. Scientists began extracting DNA from ancient bones, and suddenly, the Neanderthals weren't just bones anymore. They were code. Accessible, analyzable, comparable, a language we could finally understand. What that language told us would rewrite everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Ancient DNA shouldn't exist. DNA is fragile. It degrades. Exposed to water, oxygen, bacteria, and time, the double helix breaks down. The bonds between bases weaken and snap. The information encoded in the molecule scrambles and disappears. In most environments, DNA becomes unreadable within a few thousand years. Within a few tens of thousands of years, it should be completely gone. But should isn't is. Under the right conditions, cold, dry, stable, DNA can survive much longer. The cold of northern caves slows chemical reactions. The dryness prevents bacterial growth. The stability prevents the cycles of temperature and humidity
that accelerate degradation. In these exceptional environments, DNA fragments can persist for tens of thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years in the most favorable cases. The fragments are short. The original long strands of DNA break into pieces just a few dozen bases long. Contamination is rampant. Bacteria, fungi, and modern human handlers leave their genetic fingerprints on every sample. The signal is buried in noise. But with modern technology, next-generation sequencing, computational filtering, statistical analysis, the signal can be extracted. The fragments can be assembled. The ancient genomes can be reconstructed. This is what Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology accomplished. Over decades of methodological refinement, they developed techniques to read the unreadable, to resurrect the genomes of species that had been dead for thousands of generations. In 2010, they published the first complete Neanderthal genome, and buried in that genome was a secret that no one had expected. The secret was this: we are part Neanderthal. Not in some metaphorical sense, not as a figure of speech, literally, genetically, measurably part Neanderthal. When Pääbo's team compared the Neanderthal genome to the genomes of modern humans from around the world, they found something striking. Non-African populations, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, Oceanians, shared more genetic variants with Neanderthals than African populations did. The difference wasn't huge, a few percent at most, but it was consistent, statistically significant, and it pointed to only one possible conclusion: interbreeding. At some point after modern humans left Africa, but before they spread across the rest of the world, they encountered Neanderthals. And they didn't just compete with them or avoid them, they had children with them. Those hybrid children survived. They reproduced. They passed their mixed heritage down through the generations. And today, 50,000 years later, every person of non-African descent carries that heritage in their cells. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every European, Asian, Native American, and Australian is derived from Neanderthal ancestors. You are part Neanderthal. If you're reading this and you have ancestry from anywhere outside sub-Saharan Africa, you carry Neanderthal genes. The war that lasted 2 million years didn't end with extermination. It ended with merger, with genetic fusion, with the losers absorbed into the winners so thoroughly that we carry them inside us to this day. The same year, 2010, brought another revelation. In the Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, archaeologists had found a finger bone, a small bone from a juvenile female, perhaps 40,000 years old. Unremarkable to look at, but when Pääbo's team extracted and sequenced its DNA, they found something extraordinary. The finger bone didn't belong to a Neanderthal. It didn't belong to a modern human. It didn't belong to any species previously known to science. It belonged to something new. A population that had diverged from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago, evolved separately in Asia, and left almost no archaeological trace. They called them Denisovans, after the cave where they were found. We know almost nothing about what Denisovans looked like. We have only a handful of bones, that finger, some teeth, a fragment of skull. Not enough to reconstruct their appearance, their behavior, or their way of life. But we have their DNA, and that DNA tells its own story. Denisovans, like Neanderthals, interbred with modern humans. Their genetic legacy survives in modern populations. Not in Europeans, but in East Asians, Southeast Asians,
and especially Melanesians. Modern Melanesians, the indigenous peoples of New Guinea, Australia, and the surrounding islands, carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. More than any population carries Neanderthal DNA. A substantial portion of their genome comes from a species we didn't know existed until a decade ago. The ghosts are everywhere. In every human population, the genetic traces of extinct relatives persist. We are not pure Homo sapiens. We never were. We are hybrids, mongrels, genetic mosaics assembled from multiple ancient lineages. What did we inherit from these extinct relatives? This question has driven a decade of research. Scientists have combed through modern genomes, identifying segments that came from Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestors, trying to understand what those segments do. Some of the answers are surprising. Immune system genes. When modern humans left Africa, they encountered pathogens they had never faced before. Bacteria, viruses, parasites that had been evolving in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had no immunity, but Neanderthals did. Neanderthals had lived in Eurasia for 400,000 years. Their immune systems had adapted to local diseases. They carried genetic variants that helped them fight infections that would have been lethal to newcomers. When modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, they acquired these immune genes. The variants spread rapidly through the population, evidence of strong positive selection. They were so advantageous that they became common even though Neanderthal ancestry overall remained rare. Today, many of the immune genes in non-African populations have Neanderthal origins. Your ability to fight off certain infections may depend on genetic variants that came from Neanderthal ancestors. Skin and hair. Neanderthals had light skin and hair, adaptations to the low sunlight of northern latitudes. Modern humans, coming from tropical Africa, had dark skin suited to intense sun exposure. Some of the variants associated with light skin and hair in modern Europeans appear to have come from Neanderthals. The pale skin that helped northern populations synthesize vitamin D in weak sunlight may be, in part, a Neanderthal inheritance. High-altitude adaptation. This is where the Denisovans made their most dramatic contribution. Modern Tibetans can survive at altitudes that would incapacitate most humans. Their blood carries oxygen more efficiently in thin air. They don't suffer from the altitude sickness that afflicts lowland visitors. The gene responsible for this adaptation is called EPAS1, and the Tibetan version of EPAS1, the version that enables high-altitude survival, came from Denisovans. At some point in prehistory, modern humans moving into the Tibetan plateau encountered Denisovans who had already adapted to high altitude. They interbred. The offspring who inherited the Denisovan EPAS1 variant were able to thrive where others struggled. Over generations, the variant spread through the population until it became nearly universal. Today, Tibetans carry a gene from an extinct species, a gene that allows them to live in environments that would be lethal to most of humanity. The ghosts aren't just passengers in our genome. They're functional. They help us survive. But not everything we inherited was beneficial. Some Neanderthal genes appear to increase risk for certain diseases: depression, addiction, blood clots, skin lesions triggered by sun exposure. These variants were probably adaptive in the Pleistocene. A tendency toward blood clotting might have helped wounds heal faster in a world without antibiotics. Skin sensitivity might have provided early warning of sun damage in northern latitudes. But in the modern world, they cause problems. They're risk factors for conditions that kill millions of people every year. This is the complexity of evolutionary inheritance. Genes aren't good or bad in absolute terms. They're adapted or maladapted to specific environments. The Neanderthal variants that helped our ancestors survive Ice Age Europe may harm us in the world of processed food, sedentary lifestyles, and modern medicine. We carry the ghosts, but the ghosts don't always serve us well. There's another pattern in the distribution of Neanderthal DNA, a pattern that tells us something uncomfortable about the nature of interbreeding. Neanderthal ancestry is not evenly distributed across the genome. Some regions show high Neanderthal ancestry. Others show almost none. The regions with low Neanderthal ancestry are called deserts. They're places where natural selection has systematically removed Neanderthal variants over the past 50,000 years. Places where Neanderthal genes apparently caused problems. Two of the largest deserts are particularly striking: the X chromosome and genes expressed in the testes. When Neanderthal variants appear in these regions, they seem to have been harmful, reducing fertility, causing developmental problems, undermining reproduction. This is a signature of hybrid incompatibility. When two populations diverge for long enough, their genomes start to conflict. Genes that work fine in one background cause problems in the other. The further apart the populations, the worse the incompatibility. Neanderthals and modern humans had been separated for roughly 500,000 years. That's long enough for significant genetic divergence. Long enough for hybrid offspring to face challenges that pure lineage offspring didn't. The evidence suggests that male hybrids were particularly affected. The Y chromosome, which passes only through males, shows almost no Neanderthal contribution to modern genomes. Neanderthal DNA came almost entirely through female lineages. What does this mean? Several possibilities. Male hybrids might have been infertile like mules. They might have been less competitive as mates, less able to acquire partners and raise offspring. They might have died younger before they could reproduce. Or, and this is the darker possibility, modern human males might have killed Neanderthal males while taking Neanderthal females. A pattern of sexual violence that left genetic traces tens of thousands of years later. We cannot know which explanation is correct. The DNA tells us what happened, not how it happened. But the asymmetry is there. The evidence of male-female imbalance is there. The interbreeding was real, but it may not have been equal. It may not have been consensual. Since 2010, the field of ancient DNA has exploded. Researchers have sequenced genomes from hundreds of ancient individuals. Neanderthals from across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans from Siberia and Tibet. Early modern humans from Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Populations that lived 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 years ago. Each genome adds detail to the picture. Each sequence reveals new patterns of migration, interbreeding, and selection. We now know that interbreeding happened multiple times. Not a single encounter, but a series of contacts spanning tens of thousands of years. Neanderthals met modern humans in the Middle East, in Europe, possibly elsewhere. Each encounter left its genetic mark. We know that the interbreeding was complex. Some Neanderthals carried genetic variants that came from earlier interbreeding with modern humans. Gene flow went both directions. It was a conversation, not a one-way transfer. We know that different Neanderthal populations contributed different amounts to modern humans. The Neanderthals who mated with the ancestors of Europeans were not exactly the same as those who mated with the ancestors of East Asians. The ghost populations in different modern groups are subtly different, and we know that there were other ghosts, other populations that we haven't identified from bones, but can detect from DNA. In the genomes of some African populations, there are traces of interbreeding with an unknown archaic hominin, a ghost population that diverged from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago and persisted in Africa long enough to encounter modern humans. Who were they? We don't know. No fossils have been definitively linked to this population. They exist only as statistical shadows in the genomes of their descendants. But they were real. They lived. They met our ancestors. They had children together. And then they disappeared, like all the others. What does it mean to carry the dead inside us? This is not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question, perhaps a spiritual one. But it's worth asking. Every cell in your body contains DNA from people who died 50,000 years ago, from species that no longer exist, from lineages that lost the war that lasted 2 million years. You are their only memorial, the only proof that they ever existed for those who can read the genetic code, the only continuation of their story. In some sense, they won too. Not the victory of survival, they didn't survive, but the victory of persistence, of leaving something behind, of mattering enough that their genes were worth keeping. The Neanderthal mother who had a child with a modern human father 50,000 years ago, she couldn't have known what that child meant. Couldn't have known that her genetic legacy would spread across continents, persist across millennia, shape the biology of billions of people who would never know her name. But it did. Her child survived. Her grandchildren survived. Her genes were tested by selection and found valuable, and they spread, and they're still here. She lost the war, but she won something else, something that transcends winning and losing. There's a strange comfort in this. The extinction of the Neanderthals, of all our hominin relatives, is a tragedy, a loss of diversity, of alternative ways of being human, of stories we'll never know. But it's not complete loss. Not absolute erasure. The dead live on, distributed across billions of genomes, carried forward by descendants who never knew they existed. When you fight off an infection, Neanderthal genes may be helping you. When you adapt to a new climate, Denisovan genes may be guiding you. When you look at your skin, your hair, your face in the mirror, you're seeing the composite result of multiple human lineages merged into one. You are not just Homo sapiens. You are Homo sapiens plus the ghosts, a palimpsest of humanity, written and rewritten across hundreds of thousands of years. The war that lasted 2 million years is over, but the warriors are still here, embedded in the code that makes you who you are. The technology that revealed these ghosts is still advancing. Researchers are now extracting DNA from sediments, from cave dirt that contains no visible bones. The DNA shed by ancient inhabitants, preserved in soil, can be recovered and sequenced. We can detect the presence of Neanderthals in caves where no bones have been found. Proteins are being analyzed alongside DNA.
proteins survive longer than DNA in some conditions, and they can reveal information about species identity, diet, and disease. The field of paleoproteomics is just beginning. New computational methods are detecting ever fainter traces of ancient interbreeding. Ghost populations that contributed tiny fractions of ancestry. Events that happened at the edge of detectability. Each advance reveals more ghosts, more complexity, more evidence that the story of human evolution was not a simple tree, but a tangled web of branches that separated, rejoined, separated again. And here is the final revelation, the one that brings us full circle. We are still evolving. The Neanderthal and Denisovan variants in our genomes are not fixed. They're still being selected. Some are increasing in frequency as they prove advantageous in modern environments. Others are decreasing as they prove harmful. The ghosts are not just passengers. They're participants in an ongoing process. The genetic conversation that began 50,000 years ago is still happening, still shaping who we're becoming. In 1,000 years, the distribution of Neanderthal DNA in human populations will be different than it is today. In 10,000 years, different again. The war that lasted 2 million years is over, but its consequences are still unfolding. We carry the past inside us, but we're carrying it into the future. And the future will decide which parts of that past survive. The verdict. We began this journey with a question. Two groups of creatures, facing each other across a dying lake in East Africa 2.5 million years ago. One would inherit the earth. The other would vanish. Who really won? Now, after tracing this story through 10 chapters, through the evidence and the weapons, the minds and the extinctions, the last stands and the ghosts in our DNA, we can finally attempt an answer. But the answer is not simple. The answer is not what you might expect, because the question itself contains assumptions that the evidence has undermined. Assumptions about what victory means, about what losing means, about the nature of competition and survival and success. Let's dismantle those assumptions one by one. Assumption 1. The winner is the species that survives. This seems obvious. In any competition, the survivor wins. The extinct lose. Homo sapiens is here. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Paranthropus, Homo erectus, they're gone. Therefore, we won. Case closed. But think about this more carefully. Paranthropus boisei existed for 1.1 million years. They appeared around 2.3 million years ago and disappeared around 1.2 million years ago. More than 1 million years of continuous existence. 1 million years of successful adaptation, reproduction, survival. Homo sapiens has existed for approximately 300,000 years. We've been behaviorally modern, with art, language, complex technology, for perhaps 70,000 years. If we measure success by duration, Paranthropus already beat us. They lasted more than 3 times longer than we've been around. They outperformed us by every temporal measure. Neanderthals existed for 400,000 years. They've already outlasted us by a factor of 1.3, measured from the emergence of modern behavior. If we go extinct tomorrow, they will have been more successful than we were. Homo erectus existed for nearly 2 million years. They colonized 3 continents. They invented fire. They persisted through climate shifts that would have destroyed most species. By what measure were they failures? Only by the measure of final survival. Only if you stand at this particular moment in time and count who's still standing. But that's an arbitrary measure. It's like declaring the winner of a marathon based on who's ahead at the 20-kilometer mark. The race isn't over. We don't know who will be standing in 1,000,000 years, or 100,000, or even 1,000. Consider this scenario. 5,000 years from now, climate change has devastated human civilization. Rising seas have drowned coastal cities. Agricultural collapse has killed billions. The survivors, a few million humans scattered across shrinking habitable zones, struggle to maintain any kind of technological society. Then a pandemic strikes. A virus engineered in a laboratory 1,000 years earlier, preserved in melting permafrost, released into a population with no immunity. Within a century, humanity is reduced to a few thousand individuals, then a few hundred, then none. The last human dies in a cave somewhere, alone, not knowing they are the last. Not understanding that 300,000 years of existence is ending. Is that victory? We eliminated all our competitors. We dominated the planet. We built civilizations that touched the stars. And then we died, like everyone else, leaving nothing behind but bones and ruins and the fading echoes of our existence. Did we win? Or did we just last a little longer than the others, before losing the same game everyone loses? Assumption 2. The fight was between species, and one species won. But we've seen that this isn't quite true. Homo sapiens didn't just replace Neanderthals. We absorbed them. Their genes live on in billions of people. Their biological legacy persists, fragmented but real. The same is true for Denisovans, for whoever contributed the ghost DNA to African populations, for the unknown archaic humans whose genetic traces we're still discovering. The fight didn't end with one species annihilating the others. It ended with merger, with combination, with the creation of something new that contained elements of everything that came before. You are not pure Homo sapiens. Nobody is. You're a hybrid, a composite, a genetic mosaic assembled from multiple lineages over hundreds of thousands of years. In that sense, nobody lost completely. Not the Neanderthals, who live on in European and Asian genomes. Not the Denisovans, who live on in Melanesian and Tibetan genomes. Not the unknown Africans, who live on in ways we're still mapping. They lost their existence as separate species. They lost their cultures, their languages, their ways of being. But they didn't lose their genes. They didn't lose their place in the ongoing story of human biology. Is that victory? Is that defeat? Or is it something more complicated? A kind of persistence that doesn't fit neatly into categories of winning and losing. Assumption 3. The competition was zero-sum, and coexistence was impossible. For 2 million years, multiple human species coexisted. Not always peacefully, not without competition, but they shared the planet, occupied different niches, found ways to survive alongside each other. This was the normal state of affairs. This was how the human family worked for 99% of its history. The single-species world we live in today is the anomaly, the exception, the result of a particular set of circumstances that came together in the last
50,000 years. What if those circumstances had been different? What if Homo sapiens had expanded out of Africa during a warm period instead of a cold one? The ecological pressure on Neanderthals would have been different. They might have found refugia that remained viable. They might have persisted. What if the Toba eruption 74,000 years ago had been larger or smaller? The population bottleneck it caused might have been more severe or less. Different lineages might have survived. Different combinations might have emerged. What if the technological gap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had been smaller? Or what if Neanderthals had developed their own symbolic revolution, their own capacity for cumulative culture? They might have competed more effectively. They might have won. The outcome wasn't inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on accidents of climate, of geography, of timing, on the particular mutations that occurred in particular populations, on the specific diseases that spread or didn't spread, on 1,000 variables that could have gone differently. History is written by the survivors, and survivors tend to believe their survival was inevitable, destined, the natural outcome of superior qualities. But it wasn't. It never is. Survival is always contingent. Victory is always conditional. The winner is just whoever happened to be standing when the dust settled. So who really won the fight that lasted 2 million years? Here is my verdict, offered not as certainty but as reflection. Nobody won, and everybody won. Let me explain. Nobody won because all the competitors are gone. Australopithecus is gone. Paranthropus is gone. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova, Homo floresiensis, all gone. Every species that participated in this long competition, except one, has vanished from the earth. But that one exception, Homo sapiens, will also vanish. Not today, probably not soon, but eventually. No species lasts forever. The fossil record is clear on this point. Every species that has ever existed has either gone extinct or evolved into something different enough to be classified as a new species. We will follow our relatives into oblivion. It's just a matter of when.